Good morning and welcome to the Justice Department's first ever National Opioid Summit. My name is Mary Daly and I serve as the Department of Justice's Opioid Coordinator. I work in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General and assist Department's leadership and components with opioid-related initiatives, policies, grants, and programs. Attorney General Sessions and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein have made ending our national opioid epidemic a top priority. Our leadership measures the department's performance in this area by whether we help bring the death toll down. Our Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General have set the tone, and it's been inspiring to witness the hard work and dedication of our employees across the Department of Justice. Today we're here to discuss the role of federal law enforcement in reversing this epidemic. This summit brings together United States attorneys, federal, state, and local tribal law enforcement officials, government and public health officials, policy leaders, and most importantly, families who have lost their loved ones to this vicious epidemic. We hope you enjoy the summit. Before I introduce the Deputy Attorney General, I'd like to invite you to stand as Rhea Walker sings the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein has spent over 27 years in government service. After graduating from the Wharton School of Business and Harvard Law School, Mr. Rosenstein started his legal career as a law clerk to Judge Douglas H. Ginsburg of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Mr. Rosenstein began his career with the Department of Justice through the Attorney General's Honors Program, and he previously served as U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland between 2005 and 2017. During his tenure as U.S. Attorney, Mr. Rosenstein was a great supporter of the Department's drug enforcement efforts, regularly attending organized crime drug enforcement task force meetings and HIDTA meetings, which is where I first met him. His unwavering support for our efforts continues, and it's an honor to work for him. It is now my privilege to introduce the 37th Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Rod J. Rosenstein.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mary. I need to update my resume. I think I'm at 28 years, almost 29. It's a great honor to be here today. I want to thank Mary, not just for welcoming remarks, but for the exceptional work that she and her entire team did to organize this event today. For those of you watching on TV, we actually have a standing room only crowd here at the Great Hall of Main Justice, which I think illustrates how important this issue is to all of us. Seated on the stage, along with the Attorney General, are our Acting Associate Attorney General, Jesse Panuccio, and our Assistant Attorney General for Legal Policy, Beth Williams. They have both been working diligently on this issue with us. We're also joined in the audience by many of our United States attorneys from throughout the country, districts that are dealing with the opioid challenge, and with other department leaders, as well as public officials and private citizens. I see as well some leaders of our partner law enforcement agencies who have been working with us. And by the way, if you're wondering why many of us are wearing purple today, it's not just a coincidence. We wanted our outfits to match. We're wearing purple today in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month here at the Department of Justice, another important priority for us. On the topic this morning, though, this is the first National Opioid Summit held at the Department of Justice, but it is just one step in a very long line of steps the Attorney General has taken to combat the opioid crisis. We're honored to have many distinguished guests with us today. Our first panel will include men and women who have lost children to the opioid crisis and are turning their grief into action. Very concrete illustration for us of the devastation that the drug overdose epidemic is wreaking throughout the country. Among the panelists are retired U.S. Navy Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, who served as our nation's 9th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his wife Mary to share their story with you. We thank Admiral Winnefeld and Mary for their service, and we thank all of the panelists who are working to end the opioid crisis. In August of 1989, on the eve of the 200th anniversary of the Office of the Attorney General, then Attorney General Dick Thornburgh addressed the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association. He was 1 year into his job, and the nation was in the throes of a terrible drug epidemic. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, crack cocaine ravaged our cities, spreading violence, death, and despair. The crack cocaine epidemic led to skyrocketing murder rates in many U.S. cities, including here in Washington, D.C. In 1991, Washington's murder rate peaked at 482 total murders, a rate of 81 homicides per 100,000 residents, and the city became known as the nation's murder capital, exponentially higher than the average throughout the rest of the country. Attorney General Thornburgh reflected on how the department had changed over the 2 centuries since the appointment of the nation's first Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, in 1789. Thornburgh concluded that the Justice Department's fundamental responsibility remained the same: responding to the just expectations of the American people, as articulated by the President and by their elected representatives in the Congress. Those expectations, Thornburgh declared, impose heavy responsibilities on those of us charged with meeting them. And in 1989, Thornburgh observed, Americans expected a maximum effort against drug dealing and drug abuse. Nearly 3 decades later, we once again confront a scourge of devastation caused by drug abuse, this time a different drug. In the late 1990s, companies began marketing prescription pain medication without full disclosure of the risks, and doctors prescribed the drugs without full understanding of the consequences. Some patients became addicted to opioids as a result of misuse of pharmaceutical opioid medications. As addiction spread, the supply of heroin exploded, providing a cheaper and more potent alternative to prescription pain pills. And over the past few years, Chinese manufacturers began to produce large volumes of deadly synthetic drugs for shipment to the United States. The new chemicals are many times more potent than heroin. They contributed to an unprecedented surge in drug overdose deaths. In Baltimore a few years ago, when this issue first came to my attention, when our medical examiner revealed an increasing number of victims who had died with fentanyl in their systems, I learned about a couple of cases prosecuted in my office in Maryland in the early 1990s involving a substance they called China White, which was also a form of fentanyl. But it was prevalent now in our generation in unprecedented quantities. As a result, we now face the nation's deadliest drug epidemic ever. There were more than 72,000 deaths last year, and 2/3 of them involved opioid drugs. In addition to the deaths, many times that number of people suffer the agony of addiction, and the harm spreads to family members, friends, and neighbors who experience the consequences in their communities. The human suffering wrought by this epidemic is really beyond measure. President Trump made clear from the start of his administration that fighting the opioid epidemic is a priority. The President declared a public health emergency last year, and he directed us to make it a top priority. The President directed us to take concrete actions to solve this problem. Under the leadership of Attorney General Sessions, the Justice Department is doing just that. The Attorney General reversed the previous administration's policy of mandating lower sentences in drug cases, and he restored the traditional principle that prosecutors generally should charge defendants with the most serious, readily provable offense, and that we should disclose to the sentencing court all relevant facts. The Attorney General also instructed federal agents and prosecutors to increase the time and effort devoted to prosecuting drug dealers. As a result, the number of drug defendants charged with federal drug crimes started to increase. But as the Attorney General always emphasizes, we're not here to fill up prisons with criminals. We're here to deter crime, and that is the mission of our U.S. attorneys. We now use every tool, including both criminal and civil enforcement, to stop illegal drug dealers and cut off the supply of pills from corrupt doctors and pharmacists who fail to consider the best interests of their patients. Across the country, our federal prosecutors and agents are working closely with state, local, and tribal law enforcement to stem the flow of dangerous drugs to their communities. And we know that our efforts will make a difference. Drug enforcement, as I said, is not just about chasing criminals and punishing guilty defendants, it's about prevention. Criminal cases are very important, though, because they have a deterrent effect on the people who produce and distribute and supply dangerous drugs. They send a message about the serious consequences of drug dealing. So working with our local, state, and federal partners, and with foreign governments, we are making progress. Preliminary data from the Centers for Disease Control suggests that the work of this administration and of our career prosecutors and agents is starting to stem the tide of rising overdose deaths, but we still have a lot of work to do. When Attorney General Thornburgh in 1989 spoke about the challenges that he was facing, he noted that the department could not declare victory, even though every conventional statistical measure of enforcement showed progress. Investigations, arrests, convictions, prison terms, and forfeitures had reached record levels. Nonetheless, Thornburgh said, the expectations of the American people have not been met in this important area. Attorney General Thornburgh recognized that law enforcement alone could not end the drug epidemic. He predicted that the war on drugs, as it was called then, would not be won solely in the courtroom, but in classrooms, workplaces, communities, houses of worship, and pharmacies. And a relatively young U.S. attorney in Alabama named Jeff Sessions was a U.S. attorney at the time, and he has brought that same philosophy to us in our generation here at the Department of Justice. Overcoming an epidemic of this magnitude will require engagement by all sectors of society, not just by us here in law enforcement. That's why the Trump administration's opioid enforcement strategy incorporates prevention, enforcement, and treatment efforts. It's why Mary Daly has been appointed as the opioid coordinator for the department, and why the Attorney General has instructed every U.S. attorney to appoint an opioid coordinator in each of our 94 judicial districts to drive this initiative forward. Our exceptional law enforcement officials understand that public health and public safety go hand in hand. If we work together, we will effectively respond to the American people's just expectations, and we will save lives. And now it's my great honor to introduce a strong advocate for law and justice. Jeff Sessions devoted most of his career to public service. He served as an assistant United States attorney, as a United States attorney, state attorney general, and United States senator. He's not here to carry on business as usual. He is here to deliver on President Trump's commitment to make America safe. We at the department are fortunate for his leadership and for the example that he sets every day. So please join me in welcoming the 84th Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's very warming. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Rod, thank you for your leadership and your kind words and all the things that you do every day to drive the agenda of this department through the deputy. And Mary Daly, thank you for being both our right hands, I guess, on this subject, and we appreciate that very, very much. Mary kind of controls how we focus and drive this agenda, and it's a very important thing. I'd like to thank our Acting Associate Attorney General, Jesse Panuccio, and Assistant Attorney General, Beth Williams, and our panelists who will be with us today. And it's great to have a chance to chat this morning with Admiral Winterfield and Mary. On the Armed Services Committee for 20 years, I served right with him and saw the tremendous leadership he displayed for America as Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I know we'll enjoy and appreciate his remarks today. Also, our Assistant Attorney General Brian Benchkowski at Criminal, Uttam Dillon, our acting DEA administrator. He's doing a great job. I think FBI Deputy Director Dave Bowditch is here too. So I want to thank a whole group of our United States attorneys. Would you stand up? How many United States attorneys are in there? That is really good. Thank you. We believe that this is, well, they believe this is the best group of United States attorneys ever assembled. And I used to think the same about my Ronald Reagan class, but I helped pick this one. This is number one, I got to tell you. I really believe that. They are motivated. They're driving their offices to advance the priorities of this administration, and certainly opioids and drugs are that. We're inexpressibly proud of our federal team. They're just fabulous, but we know that 85% of law officers in America and most of the work on all cases, particularly drugs, are done, in fact, by our state and local colleagues. And I want to give a special thanks to Jonathan Thompson at the National Sheriff's Association, Kim Wagner at the Major County Sheriff's Association, Sheriff Donnie Youngblood and Michael Lewis, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, who are represented today. They are our key partners, and our law enforcement plan calls on these United States attorneys, all 94 together, to work with our local law enforcement to achieve the goals that we have set and that cannot be achieved in any other way, frankly. So it's a distinguished group, and the meeting and size of this crowd indicates the interest that you have. Before I say anything else, I want everyone to know that this department is responding to the suspicious packages that have been sent to several political leaders and a media outlet in the last few days. Yesterday, I spoke with FBI Director Chris Wray and Deputy Director Dave Bowditch, and we met with and briefed the President to bring him up to date. FBI, ATF are working on this, and I want to thank all of our law enforcement officers. In dealing with explosive devices, it just points out again the courage our officers display, because certainly I would be worried indeed to have to handle something that could be as dangerous as this. So across the administration, we condemn the actions that led to these activities in the strongest possible terms, and are determined to make sure that we get to the bottom of it and justice is done. So let me say this. Our shared work of fighting drug crime has never been more important than now. I was there in '81. Half high school seniors acknowledged using an illegal drug. Over the next 10, 15 years, that dropped by half, under 25%. So I just would say to you, we are facing a crisis today, in many ways more severe than then, but we can make a difference, and we're determined to do so. This is the deadliest drug crisis ever in our nation's existence. We've not seen anything like it. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that approximately 72,000 Americans lost their lives to drug overdoses last year, highest death total in history by far. Nothing like it we've seen. It's widely estimated that life expectancy in the United States declined for 2 years in a row, largely because of these overdose deaths. Meanwhile, millions of people are living with painful consequences of family members' addictions or addiction of their own. Most of us personally know someone who's been deeply impacted by this epidemic. So we face a very grave challenge. I feel it very deeply. But we can and we will meet it. We will reverse these destructive trends and protect our people, our health, our culture, our law. We at DOJ embrace our important role given to us by the President. It's important for you to know that we are indeed focused on this. We are making much progress, but we have much more to do. President Trump laid out a comprehensive plan to end the crisis. The three legs are prevention, enforcement, and treatment. Those are proven requirements of an effective plan to reduce drug abuse in America. He and a bipartisan Congress, I think it was only one no vote in the Senate, agreed to invest $4 billion in the opioid crisis. He signed legislation yesterday at the White House where the First Lady and he hosted an important event to bring attention to this crisis, to highlight the actions of his administration. He signed into law the SUPPORT Act, which will go a long way to improving prevention and treatment. The President has improved our prevention efforts by launching a nationwide campaign about opioid abuse, a campaign that I believe is critical. It worked in the 80s. It will work again today. He declared this month to be Substance Abuse Prevention Month, and he's taken the bold step to declare the opioid crisis to be a national health emergency. It's an unusual and lawful designation. It has a lawful meaning. The President has set the ambitious goal of reducing opioid prescriptions in America by 1/3 over 3 years. In other words, reduce the total number of opioids being prescribed by 1/3. We embrace that goal. I believe it's an important goal. In fact, we're on our way to achieving it. According to DEA, UDM's National Prescription Audit, in the first months of 2018, opioid prescriptions were down by nearly 12% compared to just the year before, and that's in addition to a 7% decline last year. So we now have the lowest opioid prescription rates in 18 years, and we're going to bring them lower. We got too many prescription opioids on the streets from a whole lot of different sources. For next year, DEA is lowering the legal limit on opioid production by an average of 10%. That's about a 44% decrease in opioid production limits since 2016. We're going after the fraudsters. Too much of this. Corrupt doctors, pharmacists, others who take advantage of addictions to line their pockets. 2 years in a row, we've set records for healthcare fraud prosecutions. They're United States attorneys primarily leading that battle. We charged 601 defendants with $2 billion in medical fraud last year. That was the most doctors, the most medical personnel, the most fraud the department has ever taken on in a single law enforcement action. This is the most defendants we've ever charged with healthcare fraud, the most opioid-related fraud defendants we've ever charged in a single action. All of this work is adding up, and it's adding up fast. I want to share with you what we are doing so we can begin to focus on that as well as what we need to do and what ideas we have for improvement in the future. The department has charged 226 doctors, criminal offenses with opioid-related crimes, convicted so far 82 of them. We've also charged another 221 other medical personnel for opioid-related crimes. 16 of those doctors, 16 doctors alone, prescribed more than 20.3 million pills illegally. It's unbelievable numbers. People lined up at some of these clinics around the block to come in to pay their cash for a doctor's visit, to get a prescription that they could fill. These numbers, prosecutions will continue to rise because we've developed new methods to attack the problem, and I've directed that each of our United States attorneys designate an opioid coordinator in their office to ensure prompt, effective enforcement. I've sent 12 prosecutors to focus exclusively on opioid-related medical fraud in some of the hardest hit areas of our country. And to help them, we have begun a new data analytics system program. We call it the Opioid Fraud and Abuse Detection Unit. This team follows the numbers, and we have the numbers. Prescription drugs have to be accounted for. The team follows the numbers, like which doctors are writing opioid prescriptions at a rate that far exceeds their peers. How many doctors' patients have actually died? We can determine that within 60 days of a prescription. Pharmacies that are dispensing disproportionately large amounts of opioids. It's been very productive, and we expect it to continue to be even more effective in the months to come. But sadly, you also today too often can order drugs through the mail. With a few clicks of a button, one can go online, have them shipped maybe from around the world to home in the United States. So we're taking unprecedented action against the killer compound fentanyl that is often trafficked through the mail and across our borders more and more. Last July, the department announced the seizure of the largest dark net marketplace in history, Alpha Bay. The team that worked on that case were given an award just yesterday. This site hosted some 220,000 drug listings. People put their address up and how to communicate, and we'll ship you illegal drugs through the mail. It's responsible for countless fentanyl overdoses and other addictions through the mail. So in August, I announced charges against a married couple we believe were once the most prolific synthetic opioid traffickers on the dark net in North America. That was an important case. We worked with our partners in Canada to help them indict a man they believe is the third most prolific darknet synthetic opioid dealer, fentanyl dealer in North America. In January, we began J-Code, a new team at the FBI that focuses specifically on the threat of online fentanyl opioid sales. They've already begun carrying out nationwide enforcement actions, arresting dozens of people around the country. In the districts where drug deaths are the highest, and some of them are very noteworthy, we're prosecuting every fentanyl case that we can in those districts, even when the amounts might be small compared to other drugs. But when it comes to synthetic fentanyl, we are working hard to stop every source of it, to make sure it does not impact too much a local community. This was tried in Manatee, Florida. We met with the sheriff and assistant United States attorney who prosecuted the case in January. This past January, they had half the number of overdose deaths as the previous January. This was targeted in fentanyl enforcement, and it saved lives. The sheriff's office went from responding to 11 overdose calls a day in Manatee County to an average of one a day. So that's why we've started a new effort, Operation SOS, to send 10 more prosecutors to help implement this kind of strategy in 10 districts around the country where the deaths and the problems are the greatest. Fentanyl isn't made in these districts. It's not made in America at all, or neither are most of the drugs. We know the vast majority of the fentanyl in this country is made in China. And that's why, under President Trump, we've become the first administration to actually begin to prosecute fentanyl traffickers. Rod has been to China. My chief of staff, Matt Whitaker, has been to China. We've urged them to help us be more effective in confronting this deadly disease. In August, I announced our third case, a 43-count indictment against a drug trafficking organization based in Shanghai. China could do more. We need them to do more. They're not doing enough. The administration recognizes that the vast majority of illegal drugs in this country got here over our southern border. They just did. 4 years in a row now, the DEA has told us that Mexican drug cartels are the single biggest drug threat to the United States. We feel in this Department of Justice a huge responsibility to deal with that problem. Last week, I designated 2 Mexican transnational criminal organizations as priority threats for our new transnational organized crime task force. The Sinaloa Cartel and the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation, or CJNG. And they'll be top targets of us. We're developing a coordinated strategy to deal with them. I announced 15 indictments against 45 CJNG leaders, funders, transporters, drug sources, and distributors. We're interdicting drugs coming into this country at record levels, too. The Coast Guard seized a record number of drugs in 2017, about 500,000 pounds total. 500,000 pounds, worth about $6 billion. Over the last 12 months, DEA seized more than 500,000 pounds of cocaine, 6 tons of heroin, 50 tons of methamphetamine, and more than 2 tons of fentanyl. 70% more fentanyl than the year before. So taken together, in the last year, DEA has seized enough drugs to kill every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. We are seizing more drugs, prosecuting more cases. We've increased prosecutions and targeted more cases effectively. For opioids, we prosecuted 36% more defendants than the previous 4-year average. We've increased heroin prosecutions, OxyContin prosecutions. We've tripled the number of fentanyl prosecutions for 2 years in a row. And these are preliminary numbers. They don't include health care fraud charges, so the increases are actually larger. What is most important is that overdose deaths in this country, we hope and hope to say continues, have perhaps plateaued, maybe even started to come down a bit. I announced 4 particular goals of mine personally when I became Attorney General to reduce violent crime. After 2 years of increases, it dropped. To reduce homicides, it had gone up 20% in 15 and 16. Those have reduced. We wanted to reduce prescription opioids. Those have fallen. And we wanted to deal with overdose deaths. And we're beginning to see some progress. I'm confident if we stay the course, we'll see more. Drug overdose deaths per year in this country increased from 2012 to 2017, 73%. It appears that these numbers, the growth has stopped. According to the Center for Disease Control, drug overdose deaths increased on a month-by-month basis until last September. They've been going up steadily. The rolling 12-month total of overdose deaths in America decreased by 2.3% from September 17 through February. So these are preliminary numbers, and we want much bigger decreases than 2%. But it's broken we believe, the increase. And it gives us confidence that we may be on the right path. We're not going to stop here, and I'm announcing some new steps. We're announcing $27.8 million in grant funding to 17 law enforcement agency task groups through our anti-heroin task force program. These funds will be used for criminal investigations in states that are particularly suffering from the opioid crisis. We will invest $7 million in state investigations of methamphetamine, which is a big problem in many of our states, and particularly in the West. I'm announcing $35 million through our Office of Victims of Crime to help children who've been victimized as a result of opioid abuse, often their parents. These funds will support things like counseling, mentoring, foster care, legal services, training for school personnel, and law enforcement. Administration is investing more than $34 million in treatment and assistance to those in need, but a lot more through the HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, will handle most of the treatment funds. And finally, I'm announcing a new Appalachian Regional Prescription Opioid Strike Force. Appalachia has been hard hit. Some of the first pill mills in America, as many of you know, started in southern Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia. And so this day, these communities, and to this day, they continue to suffer tragically high rates of addiction, overdose, and deaths. So in fact, we'll be going to Kentucky tomorrow afternoon to meet with prosecutors and investigators there. Our new strike force will be composed of 12 additional opioid fraud prosecutors, with their own team of federal law enforcement agents. They will help us find the doctors and pharmacists, professionals of all kinds who are flooding our streets with drugs and put them behind bars. We cannot allow this to continue. We will be relentless. We will continue to get smarter and better at our work. And these new steps are going to build on the successes that we've already had as an administration and as a department. And we're going to keep up the pace. We're not going to slow down. And this conference today will be a good way for us to consolidate, come together to determine where we are now, what we've accomplished, and what we'll need to do in the future. The stakes have never been higher. We've never seen the challenge we've had today, and we're seeing today, but our determination has never been higher. I thank all of you that will be participating in the panel today, all of you here that care about this matter, and I particularly want to thank our federal officers and our state and local partners for the dedication that they're showing, and we're going to turn the tide and make this a safer country. Thank you all, and God bless. Thank you.
Thanks to our Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General for those wonderful remarks. I'd like to thank both the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General for their leadership in this important area. We're going to start panel one. The Deputy Attorney General has to leave for some previously scheduled meetings. The Attorney General will remain for the first panel, but we'd like to give them a round of applause. I think we'll be setting up for panel one so we can take a little stretch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Sorry?
Is that okay? I just have to keep
We need to start now. If everybody could please start taking their seats, we're going to begin.
It's not staying down for this, is it?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our first panel. Could you take your seats, please? Thank you. This panel is entitled The Opioid Crisis, A Call to Action, and it's intended to be just that, a call to action for all of us here today. Each of our panelists lost a child to a drug overdose and now works to help end the crisis. Our moderator is Darlene Hutchinson, Director of the Office for Victims of Crime. Ms. Hutchinson joined the department in August of 2017, bringing with her 20 years of experience in victim advocacy. As the Attorney General announced, Ms. Hutchinson's office will award $34.6 million in grants to help children who have been victimized by the opioid crisis. Please welcome Ms. Hutchinson and our panelists to the stage.
Let's see. Is this working? I don't think so.
Hello? We'll just speak
Hello.
really loudly.
Or somebody from the AV might come rescue us. But anyway, it's an honor to be here with these distinguished panelists. I'm always in awe of folks who can take their pain and grief and the unfortunate circumstances that they've been through and channel it into helping others. So that's a really amazing thing. I believe many of you have the agenda and know basically who we have with us today. I'll do some early introductions just to cover that. But the Admiral to my left here, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, is retired from the U.S. Navy, 37 years that he had there, and most recently was the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where he retired in 2015. He's also been an instructor and commanded the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, and is a distinguished professor currently at the Sam Nunn School for International Affairs at Georgia Tech. And his wife, Mary, next to him there, is a co-founder with him of SAFE, a nonprofit organization that stands for Stop the Addiction Fatality Epidemic. They're doing some phenomenal work in that way, and I know they'll be telling you more about that. But Ms. Winnefeld is also, for many years, worked actively to advance the health and wellness of military and veteran families. And Further down, we have Walt Raines from Kentucky. He is part of the U.S. Attorney's Office team there, that HEAT, they call it, Heroin Education Action Team in the Eastern District of Kentucky, where they're doing a lot of public speaking and going out and changing policy and concepts about how to affect and attack the opioid and drug abuse epidemic that we're suffering through. And it's a great partnership with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the families there in that area. And then at the very end, we have Kevin Mira, who is a co-chairman of City of Angels, a nonprofit organization in New Jersey that he helped found. It's a peer-to-peer grassroots recovery center that I'm sure we'll be hearing more about. And as a recovery coach, he has also been able to help and work with hundreds of families and individuals over the years, and also been very active in a veteran support services group. As Mary was saying, and the Attorney General was so great to announce and mention, the Office for Victims of Crime, which is within the Office of Justice Programs within DOJ, all of us at OJP are really stepping up our efforts. It's all hands on deck with what we're doing to attack the opioid epidemic. And more than $300 million of grant funding is coming out of OJP within the Office of Victims of Crime. None of our funding is actually taxpayer money. It's funding from criminal defendants and fines and fees that the offenders pay into the system. And so we're turning that around to help the children that are crime victims as a result of the opioid epidemic. So we're thrilled to be and very excited to have the Attorney General's support on that program. So we've just awarded 42 grants plus 10 with our partners over at BJA. And so we're going to do some phenomenal work that I hope in a year from now we'll be reporting back and tell you about the success we've had. But I want to give the panelists an opportunity to share with you some of their stories and what they're doing in their field.
Well, good morning. And thank you. I'm sorry, I guess it's not working. And thank you for all the work that you're doing, because as we know, there's 94,000 kids in foster care, and that's underreported in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And they deserve a chance, or we're going to lose an entire generation, which is going to affect our American dream. Good morning, I'm Mary Winnefeld. My husband and I, James Winnefeld, have started SAFE Project as a result of losing our son, Jonathan Winnefeld, September 7th, 2017, on his 4th day of college, to heroin laced with fentanyl. So how did we get here? We're here, on behalf of Jonathan. All of you apparently have his essay. You know that his desire in life was to help those who could not help themselves. So we are carrying on his legacy. Jonathan was, in my opinion, in our opinion, a great young man, compassionate, loving, great athlete, smart, intelligent, creative. But all along, he was struggling internally from a very young age.
Now, we believe that there are 3 pathways into substance use disorder. The first one is overprescription for a medical procedure or dental procedure or an injury. The second one is what you might call the party path. If you do this stuff enough, you will become dependent upon it. And the third is self-medication for some sort of a mental health challenge. And when you consider that about 1/3 of young Americans entering college have some sort of anxiety or depression or something like that, and it's easy for somebody to hand them a pill that'll make them feel better. We believe that choice is a very abstract concept when it comes to this particular epidemic. Imagine when a doctor is prescribing something to you. You should trust a doctor or a dentist. Choice is actually very abstract. And our son was actually on the path of self-medication for a mental health issue.
Right. He was not the party boy. All along from very early age, probably from age 4, he was suffering from anxiety and depression, which was misdiagnosed as attention deficit because he was an introvert. He went on the medication Adderall. For those of you who are familiar, it's an amphetamine, highly addictive, and sets the brain up for substance use disorder. If I had one decision that I would do over again, I would have run from that doctor's office and never put my son on that. We found out, unbeknownst to us, he was self-medicating himself to offset what Adderall was doing to his brain. For someone who has anxiety, it was revving him up even more. Alcohol started missing. I confronted him about it. By then, he was getting Xanax in high school, and along with smoking weed. Long story short, we pulled him out of his senior year in high school. He was a senior. He was the varsity pitcher on his baseball team, had already been accepted into college. Pulled him out. We put him into 15 months of residential treatment. Treatment works. We saw our son come back to us. His brain was recovering. You all see the essay that he wrote. He got his EMT qualification while he was in treatment. We figured this is a home run. His brain was coming back. Time to move on and go into college to assimilate back in the world. We lost him in that very vulnerable transition period. We lost him on the 4th day of college, as I mentioned, to heroin laced with fentanyl that he purchased from an open-air heroin market that is still going on and has been for the last 16 years in Denver, Colorado, every night from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m.
Now, we're very, very grateful to a particular detective on the Denver police force who relentlessly researched and tried to find Jonathan's killer. He actually did find Jonathan's killer, and we're very grateful to him for that. We're also very grateful to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver for doing everything they could to gather enough evidence to prosecute this person, but it just came up short, and we know they did the very best that they could. But you can imagine how it hurts to know that Jonathan's killer is still at large in Denver. We know who he is, and he's probably killing somebody else's kid. So what do you do about this? We decided that rather than turn into a little ball of anger, grief, and shame, which we cannot blame anybody for doing, by the way.
And there are bad days.
We decided to start a nonprofit, Stop the Addiction Fatality Epidemic, and we decided to structure it along the 6 things that are very deeply interrelated that we believe the nation needs to do in order to reverse this epidemic. And they are very deeply intertwined. It begins with public awareness, so that we can get the public behind the effort the President has fortunately begun leading to get the resources, both public and private, in organizations like ours to help turn the tide. The other public awareness thing that's so important is reversing stigma, because there is a lot of bad stigma out there. There's great print journalism, but the photojournalism is enhancing stigma, that those people under underpasses are not my family. So we're working very hard on the public awareness piece. We're working very hard on the full spectrum prevention piece. The reason we were not at the White House ceremony yesterday is because we were talking to 750 high school kids in Delaware. That's where we get tremendous leverage in giving them a nuanced message of stories and of addiction science so that they can make their own decision about what to do here.
Just say no doesn't work with them.
It's not a sophisticated enough message for a high school kid these days. Our third line of operation is prescription medicine. We have to go after the irresponsible sectors of the pharmaceutical industry, which thankfully the Justice Department is doing. We also believe that doctors and dentists need to act far more responsibly than they are. But where we find some of our greatest leverage is with patients, because it turns out, in our view, that patients are actually smarter than the doctors and dentists. A lot of them are wisely turning down opioid prescriptions that doctors and dentists are demanding that they take. We're also, in this area, pushing very hard for other programs such as DEA's Take Back Day, another one coming this weekend, a great program. It's an unbelievable segment of our population that doesn't realize the hazard that's just sitting right in their medicine cabinet and need to dispose of it responsibly. Next line of operation, our fourth one, is treatment and recovery, because there simply are not enough treatment resources in this country. They are not standardized with a good set standard of care well enough. They are not as accessible as they need to be, and they certainly aren't as affordable as they need to be, and we have to do better. And the bill that was just passed by the Congress may not be quite enough for us, but it's a great start in the right direction. And the last line of operation that we have is family outreach and support. And this is about, if we only knew then what we know now, we would still have our son. And so we have put out a lot of lessons learned on our website, starting all the way back in elementary school through the addiction process, the treatment process, and transitioning out of treatment. And we hopefully will be able to help people. I mentioned these are intertwined. Let me give you an example of how these 6 lines of operation are deeply dependent on each other. If I could snap my fingers and make the prescription medicine piece go away overnight, I would prevent a large influx of new substance-dependent people, to be sure, and we should do that. But I would also create an additional demand signal for people to go into very dangerous substances like heroin that's laced with fentanyl that killed our son.
Methamphetamine.
And that is bad enough. If we don't have adequate levels of law enforcement to take the dealers off the street, and we don't have adequate levels of treatment as a catch for the people who are now unable to get their prescription medicine on which they depend, then we will fail. If we don't have public awareness to lower the stigma, those people won't seek treatment in the first place. And if we don't have good family outreach and support, we won't have the loving and understanding families that are absolutely essential to help somebody recover from this disease. Now, we funnel these two things up through things we call safe campuses, which is about encouraging campuses to have prevention programs and to have recovery programs for their students, and safe communities, where we try to gather all the best practices we can find from communities that are fighting this epidemic, bundle them back up conveniently under our 6 lines of operation, and put them back out. I will tell you that there is a great deal that can be done at the federal level and is being done gradually. There's a great deal that can be done at the state level. The governors are starting to feel pressure, and some of them are really stepping up in a major way to fight this epidemic. But we win this at the community level, the local level, and that's what we're all about. Thanks a lot for having us here today.
And we look forward later on to questions, and we also love collaboration. We are all about collaboration. We want best practices. So we look forward to working with you.
Thank you so much, Mary and Admiral, for bringing that very powerful story here. And I want to bring Walt and Kevin into this also. Walt, I know, has been touched by an very unfortunate situation, and share a few words with us, if you would, Walt.
Well, it's when I was asked to be on this panel, I actually said, me? Here? And I said, well, what do they want? And all I kept hearing was, they want your story. And last night, I was on a conference call with Drew and Katie from the DOJ just to talk about this today. And I said again, are you sure you want me? And what is it that you really want? And again, they said, we want to hear your story. Okay. So to start with a story about our son, Zach, I want to start at the end and then go to the beginning. Zach was 24, married, his wife pregnant. And they had kind of a young couple disagreement. Zach came home that night. And the night he came home, we met him at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. He went to a meeting. He was shortly out of rehab, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and he was going to meetings, and we went to this meeting with him. If you've never been to an NA meeting, I highly recommend you go. It's very enlightening, and you will learn more in that 1-hour meeting than you may even think you know about drugs. But when Zach came home, we were home at our house, and Zach went to his room, and we went to bed. Then the next morning, July the 4th, 2015, my wife says, or I said to my wife, may want to get him up because I think Katie's coming down here, his wife. She goes in his room. She comes back out and gets me and says, I think you need to go in there. I have a medical background. I went in and Zach was laying face down. I turned him over, started working on him. There was a needle next to him in the floor, and I moved it a little bit out of the way because when you're in a situation like that, your brain is firing so fast you can't even imagine. But I thought, police will want that. I moved it over. When I turned him over, you could tell it was going to be too late. But we started working. And then, I guess it was 10 minutes, EMS came and they took over and took him out and took him to a local hospital. We followed up there. By that time, Katie had come and was there. And of course, the whole neighborhood was there, as you can imagine. 3 or 4 police cars, and ambulance, and it was a scene that you can't imagine that you're in. You just can't imagine it. It never escapes my mind. It's there all day. I could be having a conversation with somebody, not even thinking about anything, and out of the corner of your eye, you see someone that is a glimpse of your child, and you're right back to it. Zach was our only child. So how did that happen? How did that happen? My wife's a 38-year retired school teacher. I went to work every day. We were middle class. We were you. We were you. We were just making a living. We were never on an episode of Cops. We didn't have them in our neighborhood. There was no reason. We were just middle class America. About the age of 14, Zach's story sounds remarkably just like your son. ADD problems, anxiety problems. Started self-medicating with marijuana. Started all of a sudden having trouble at school. How did it? We didn't know how to stop it. We went to physicians. We went to counselors. Zach started missing school, so we had him arrested. At the age of 16, you have your own son arrested because he won't go to school. Try that one on for size when you have children. To have the police come into your house and arrest your child because you know it's the best thing for them because you can't stop it. We tried everything. We had Zach in rehab countless of times. We had him in rehab mainly one time because of just overuse of marijuana, because we saw what it was doing to him. It's just tearing him down, turning him into a person that we didn't recognize. And when you go to an NA meeting, which I asked you to please go to, ask those men and women that are in those meetings, how did you start? How did you get here? And 80%, 90% of them will say, I started with marijuana. And when I hear how we need to legalize marijuana for this or for that, I understand the medical, but I just shake my head. When you go to those meetings, just ask. Most of them don't say, I started with, over-the-counter drugs or opioids. They start with marijuana. It opens the door. But we were the normal family. We went to Disney World, and we went to the beach, and we went to Graceland, and we did all this stuff. And it just slipped away from us. It just slipped away. And Zach was out of rehab just a couple weeks, and he was doing a favor for one of his so-called friends that we never approved of, but what can you do? And Zach's fatal dose of drugs didn't come from a guy at the corner or come from some guy he knew. It came from a federal employee. Came from the United States Post Office, came to our house, sat in a brown envelope, and it was fentanyl. It came out of Quebec, Canada. We didn't know. I never even heard of the dark web. I actually still don't even understand what it is, but that's where it came from. It was hand-delivered to our house. We gave it to Zach. We didn't open it up. You don't think we think about that every day? But that's what this whole addiction process does. It takes a little bit of everybody that's involved. And everybody in America knows there's a drug problem. They simply just don't care until it shows up on their doorstep, or their brother's doorstep, or their sister's doorstep. That's when they go, oh, wow. But everybody knows there's a problem. And now my wife and I are part of an organization that you talked about earlier called HEAT, Heroin Education Action Team. And it started in the Eastern District of Kentucky, the U.S. Attorney's Office. And when my wife and I were invited to go to the first meeting, I was very skeptical. I mean, what can you do? I mean, you just kind of want to throw your hands up and go, what can you do? But what it is, it's a group of people like me and my wife and people who have suffered this loss. And Jenny Parker, sitting right here, leads this up. And she gets the right people to the right organization. My wife's a retired school teacher, like I said, so she goes to schools. I go to more adult organizations. There's people that we have a person for every type of organization. And I want to challenge the U.S. attorneys that are in here. If you don't have HEAT where you're at, why not? It helps. It works. They hear our stories. My wife comes home after every meeting and says, the kids line up to tell her about their dad or their mom or their brother or their uncle. And it's a way for kids to know, hey, I'm not alone. Because when this happens to you, I pray for every one of you in here that it never happens, but if it ever does, you feel you're alone. Even though you're not, you feel like you are. So, it's a high honor to be here. I wish I wasn't here for this reason. But that's my story.
Thank you, Walt. And you may be questioning why you're here, but I think all of us know exactly why. I think you sharing your story and along with these other panelists is just very powerful, and your words also to the U.S. attorneys to encourage them to develop a program like you guys have in Kentucky is very, very strong endorsement. And I want to bring Kevin into this too. Kevin, I know, has been doing this work probably longer than anybody on the panel, probably about a decade now in the New Jersey area. And you've probably learned a lot of lessons over the years of what works and what hasn't worked as well. Share with us some of the work that you're doing in New Jersey and how you got here.
Good morning. Can you hear me good? Great. My cell phone number is 609-731-9166. 609-731-9166. And I don't say that out of arrogance or confidence that you're going to want to call me. I say it because by the time I get to the end of my presentation, I'll probably forget to say it. So I'm going to give it to you now. I want to thank Attorney General Sessions. We met over at the White House. You're a Southern gentleman. Us parents need you, and we need you now, and I thank you. I also want to thank Darlene for moderating our panel. And especially thank Mary and Katie for spending so much time talking to me on the phone, and just listening to my ramblings. We always talk in honor of our children, but today I also want to talk in appreciation of Detective Scott Kivett from the Robbinsville Police Department. Scott is one of those officers who gets it, and when he calls me up, devastated by arresting someone, and then tells me months later about their recovery. But then he calls me and tells me that the person relapsed and passed away. I understand what it's taken from his heart as a local law enforcement officer. I also want to recognize someone in the audience, Don Holman, who's here. His son Garrett passed away because, Attorney General, you were talking about the synthetics and the fentanyl coming in from China, and Garrett passed away from U47700. And usually I tell my parents, when you lose, if you get out of bed in the morning, you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. Don't tell that to Don, because in the first year, he was in the White House twice and invited to a session with the First Lady. Don't stand in the way of a parent on a mission. Today's the DOJ Opioid Summit, so I'm hoping that my presentation will generate conversation and help you to think out of the box. Usually I talk to high schools and I talk about preparation, but I was thinking about it last night. It's not different for you. Many of you, your academy training, your schooling prepared you for these careers that you have today. For me, my love of history prepared me to get involved in government. As a 38-year utility worker, that prepared me to work 2 shifts at Ground Zero after 9/11. I'm Irish Catholic. I always say I come from a small Irish Catholic family. There was only 8 kids in my family. But that prepared me for my Irish activism, and I was one of only about 15 people in the United States during the Irish peace process, Northern Ireland peace process, that was invited to the State Department when the envoy came back to talk about that. It also prepared me to be invited to the White House St. Patrick's Day receptions. So whether you consider those successes or experiences, none of them prepared Marianne and I for June 30th, 2008, when we woke up and found my son dead on his bedroom floor from a heroin overdose. His name was Kevin Cayley. He was 24. We called him KC, and I affectionately referred to him as a knucklehead. That's what he was. Great kid, loved life, but he had a tiger by the tail called heroin. City of Angels, as Darlene said, I'm a volunteer for City of Angels. And when Casey died, parents of his friends and his friends came to Marianne and I and said, our daughter has a problem. Can you help us? As you can imagine, like most parents, we didn't know what to do. But we set out to help, and we found out we needed to learn more. So I went to a local judge, Tony Massey, and we sat and talked. I said, Tony, I'm learning about addiction and treatment, but all these kids have been arrested. I need to learn about law enforcement. So he brought in a retired cop who had a program in the city of Trenton, Dean Barklow. So there was 3 of us in the room, then 5, then 15 with chart pack all over the wall. And if we couldn't figure out how the system worked, we asked someone to come in and show us. And in March of 2009, we took $1,000 out of Casey's Memorial Fund and we started City of Angels. The name wasn't particularly special. One of our crew watched the movie City of Angels. Sounded good to us. City of Angels is a nonprofit in New Jersey. It's a 501c3. Everybody's a volunteer, nobody's paid. So all the money that we raise goes out to helping. When we started out, it was just to help people get help. So we got trained to be interventionists. We got support meetings, AA, NA, counselors in. Then we started to get some of our kids in recovery. We would go to high schools, church groups, so that they would have an opportunity to do testimonials. And then we started doing advocacy. And I'll tell you, I owe it all to Dr. Oz. Sounds funny, but it was a chance meeting with Director Botticelli from the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, which wound up inviting us to the first HIDA conference in Towson University. MJ was there, he's my hero. To the White House for parents meetings, and then in March, I was asked to speak at the White House Opioid Summit. And when I stood up to talk, as a matter of fact, Attorney General, you were sitting up on stage, I just kind of looked and I said, I couldn't fathom 10 years ago that our journey would take us from Casey's bedroom to the East Room. But it did. One of the things we concentrated on at City of Angels is recovery coaching. It's an emerging entity in this field. And we found it back in 2011. We didn't act on it until 2012. But we went and got trained as recovery coaches. And since then, we've trained about 500 recovery coaches. In 2008, it was basically volunteers. In 2012, it was called recovery coaches. Now they call it peer recovery specialists, going into the police departments and into the emergency rooms to help those that have had overdoses or have been arrested. We also have a program, I talked to the Admiral a little earlier, we call Warrior Down. We started to notice a lot of vets were coming out of service. Many of them had dirty paper, which means it was a less than honorable discharge. So you could have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq, unblemished record. Afghanistan, you had a dirty urine, you get court-martialed out. You come home with no benefits. These people served our country, they come home with no benefits. And we started a Warrior Down program, and the Slattery Detachment of the Marine Corps League up in North Jersey adopted us, was making monthly trips to Walter Reed, to the Wounded Warrior Battalion down in North Carolina, and we're trying to address our vets. That's a little bit about how we got here and where we are. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're going. And since we're here with law enforcement, I'm going to try to focus on law enforcement. Show of hands, who's federal? Who's state? Who's local? Okay, so what we have to hope for today is that what we're talking about will start breaking down some of the silos so that what you all do is seamless. Have you heard law enforcement has no role in this? That law enforcement doesn't have a role, that this is a health thing? Right. If you break up the community into 3 segments, medical, educational, and law enforcement you were going to think are the last ones over the fence because you were trained to arrest. Let me tell you, you were light years ahead of the other communities. They're still kicking heroin addicts out of emergency rooms, and try to get into a high school and do a talk. For that, I applaud you all. You're forever in our thoughts. So quickly, let's talk about Scott Kivett. Scott Kivett was on our board almost 10 years ago as a Robbinsville police officer. And it was Scott Kivett who, working with us, created his CARE program, community addiction response effort, to where if they arrest someone, they'll bring one of our recovery coaches in. We know that if you invest $1 in prevention and treatment, we're going to save $12 between law enforcement and medical. So if we can go in and that intervention stop 2 years down the road where it's a felony, it's going to be successful. That's something done on a local level. What about Tom Carr and Jeff Beeson? I met them in Towson, and I kept up the network and went and met with them. Tom Carr, when I was with him, he holds his phone up. He says, "Kev, look at this." And he shows me an app for his phone. How many of you know about OD Map? How many states are employing it? It's an app for overdose reporting. Real time. live. Major Juan Colon and Adam Pahemis over the New Jersey State Police DMI, Drug Monitoring Initiative. I met them, and I sat with them. It was interesting. We're all looking at where the overdoses happen, and their data was able to show us where they were coming from. Where are they coming from to get their drugs? Sharon Joyce from the Attorney General's office in New Jersey has just been in charge of opioids there, such as Mary. And she sat with me. Remember, I'm a nobody. I'm not a professional. I'm just a dad who buried his kid. But she sat with me to hear what I had to say, and gave me 30 minutes, and after an hour and a half, she said, "Can you put all this in writing?" Chief Brian Pesh of Bordentown and Scott Kofina in Burlington County, prosecutor, they sat with me and devised not only a care program, but now we're talking about recovery houses, which is the scourge of your community, for us to train these guys to be recovery coaches that the police departments can lean on right in the community. So rather than being a scourge, they contribute to the community. Special Agent Joe Crowder, Virginia State Police. Can you imagine a special agent in the state police holding a local event in his high school on drugs and alcohol? I still remember to this day, Joe, when I was on stage presenting, I drove all the way from New Jersey. There's nothing in the Roanoke Valley, let me tell you, I drove there. But Joe saying, "Do you see that police chief out there, Kev?" I said, "Yeah." "That I introduced you to?" I said, "Yes." He said, "He won't allow Narcan in his police vehicles." He said, "That's for the EMTs." So we know there needs to be a seismic shift in how we speak. Patrolman Tamika Veal, Detective Sergeant Joe Ciaraboni from Bordentown, Tamika's from Trenton, Patrolwoman Holly Arena from Princeton, and Patrolman Larry Cabela from Ewing. They actually came in and took our recovery coach course to become recovery coaches, to be a resource in their police department so that someone's there. We talked about domestic violence earlier. That's where we got the idea for a standard operating procedure for recovery coaches. Just like with domestic violence, when someone is brought in arrested, the wife is brought in to be given resources. That's where we modeled this all after. Prosecutor Sean Dalton and Detective Danny LaRusso, we call it the Gloucester Initiative, down in South Jersey, our City of Angels satellite in South Jersey. They got together, prosecutor, 10 police chiefs, Detective LaRusso, the school, and Dr. Jim Baird from the hospital to form an initiative that they're all working together to educate, to put a resource in the emergency rooms, to put a resource in the police department. And Sergeant Craig Hoover from East Brunswick. Craig pours over his arrest records. Then he goes out and visits the resident of where the addict lives to see if they want help. So I can say, from where I stand, that our experience with law enforcement has been positive. So if anybody tells you that you don't have a role to play, tell them come see me. So this segues into where else are we going? What if Sergeant Hoover had the ability to visit addicts before they overdosed based on their likelihood to overdose? Sounds like The Wizard of Oz. Maybe you should talk to retired Major Juan Colon, who in New Jersey, where the DMI leads the nation, Juan is able to data mine that type of information. As we create our dashboards of tomorrow, the data mining has to be right. At COA, our concentration has been on the front end, interventions, family meetings. But yet all these kids are still dying. I have some smart people at City of Angels. They're all volunteers. But they started to talk to me about wellness, about gut-centric. What you put in here affects here. You know, when when your insurance runs out, Admiral, Walt, Mary, Debbie, when your insurance runs out, treatment doesn't want you anymore. Imagine being in a treatment center and your insurance runs out. You say, I'd like to stay for 3 more weeks. I'm doing real good. They're like, huh? What? So when insurance runs out, nobody wants them. Really, the only thing left is AA. And there's 20 million people in recovery and only about 1 to 2 million people in AA. And nothing against AA, but it's cigarettes, coffee, and donuts. So City of Angels, we're looking at the back end, because when we started, nobody was doing what we were doing. But now, there's so many other groups. There's treatment centers, there's interventionists, all doing the front end. So we're looking at the back end because, Attorney General, we have to learn how to extend the recovery. If City of Angels helps 100 people get into treatment, 2 to 5 stay in recovery. The other 97 go back to their heroin. And now with the introduction of fentanyl, that's what's killing them. So we have to find a way to extend their wellness. And that's what we're looking at. And one of those things is called HBOT. Any divers in here? Hyperbaric treatment? Does anybody hear about that? Any EMTs in here? So if you go in and you're found on your bedroom floor from carbon monoxide poisoning, and you're brought back to the hospital, do you know how you're treated? In a hyperbaric chamber. Do you know what that's called? Detox. Did you ever hear that word before? So we are looking at City of Angels using HBOT therapy. We're working with the VA, the RISK Center. Did you ever hear of RISK? War-Related Illness and Injury Service Center. We have one in New Jersey. There's only 3 in the country. We're working with Dr. Gates and Dr. Osanubi on oxygen therapy. Talked to VA Secretary Shulkin before he left about it. The VA is starting to look at it for PTSD and for traumatic brain injury. But if you look at a SPECT scan of a traumatic brain injury or PTSD, it looks very similar to a brain on alcohol or heroin. So if it can fix that, why can't it fix that? So we're looking at that. So maybe the future of City of Angels is like the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. We were talking about creating, for our veterans, a research institute for addictions. I call City of Angels a small mom and pop nonprofit, but we believe we do big things. And it's because we got big friends. Mary, Attorney General,
Kevin,
the chair.
While you're talking about that too, I know you bring up about the recovery and extending that, and I think that's such a critical area. I know that Mary and the Admiral have worked on too, and how that's a very vulnerable situation that someone's in. I don't know if you want to address that quickly and then go back to Kevin. And
it is. That's where we lost our son. Everybody also goes to how many deaths and reporting that. Where are the overdoses? Baltimore has a great program that's doing that. There are several around. One thing that I would love for people to do is reach out. There's an app out there that shows you where Narcan is located in communities. That's what's saving lives. That's what's helping to bring down the number. So, but transition is definitely, we need to change the culture in this country. We need to look at how insurance reimburses. Mental health and substance use needs to be reimbursed the same way we do for diabetes or any other chronic illness, chronic disease, because addiction, substance use disorder is a lifelong disease.
I think the specific question you're asking is, why is it so dangerous when people are coming out of long-term treatment? And several of us have lost people in that particular phase. And what's really going on scientifically is that your brain has recovered the opioid receptors that we all have that govern our well-being, that were saturated when the person was addicted, now are clean. They are reset, as it were. And because those opioid receptors have a lot to do with controlling respiration in our bodies, if you go out and you relapse and you use the same dose of the drug that was required to overcome that desensitized opioid receptor, and you put that on a resensitized opioid receptor, that's when you can kill yourself. And that's why you're so vulnerable in that first few weeks coming out of recovery, because You're still new in the world again. It's a completely new experience for you. You're very vulnerable to even just seeing drug paraphernalia, reinitiating those cravings. And then if you take the same dose of the drug, there's a very good chance it'll kill you. And if it's got fentanyl in it, you know, you're a sitting duck. So that's why that particular phase is so dangerous. It has to be, I think we've talked about a moment ago, very carefully managed. And when people can get through that, there's a pretty good chance that if they have the right support from their families and from the system at large, that they can actually recover.
Yeah, a cultural shift. And again, as we mentioned, going into college, now you've got 1/3 of all students entering have some form of mental health illness. And it's anxiety, it's depression, it could be bipolar, it could be something more severe. But when you put that on top of the stress and anxiety of going into college, and Adderall, again, is your #1 study drug, you're setting people up for failure. So
when we talk about medication-assisted treatment, we also talk about medication-assisted recovery. And when we hear somebody say, well, you know, you're taking a drug like buprenorphine, and you're only substituting that for another drug, I say, bring it on. I would rather have substituted that drug for the one that killed my son. And if he had been on the right medication-assisted treatment recovery regimen, we probably still have him today.
Well, I know, Kevin, I want to let you finish and wrap up there. I've got a couple questions I want to send to Walt, but I think we've got about 10 minutes left. And
Sure.
But I know you have some other.
I'm time-sensitive challenge, so I apologize. I know I've taken more of my time, but I just want to conclude with this. I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is not a deck of cards. These are prayer cards of the funerals that I've attended just at City of Angels. That chair, that's to help you understand what you're doing. There's 62 days between this conference and Christmas. And in that time, there's going to be 12,231 empty chairs at Christmas dinner tables because of overdoses. You want to know me and the Admiral and Walt, and Debbie and Sue because of what we've learned. You don't want to be us because of what we went through. We're broken. We're not defeated. Thank you.
I think it. We do hear so much about the statistics, and those are numbers on paper, but when you're able to hear the real stories and see how this epidemic is affecting every demographic and breaking down some of the stigmas that we've talked about too, that there's so many families that are affected by this, and the powerful stories of speaking out and telling how we got here, and maybe there's some interventions. And I think one thing is the common theme I'm hearing too, especially Walt and Kevin, that the partnerships with law enforcement and prosecutors and the victim service, or the services that are out there in the community is so important that none of us should be operating in our silos, that we can partner with each other, and it's so much more powerful. And Walt, how did you first get into this? Did you reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office, or did they reach out to you, or how did y'all find one another?
Well, I think I heard it through my wife, who heard it from a friend of hers there was a family friend who lost their daughter on Christmas Eve 2014. And it was the day after Christmas. I took the day off work and was reading the paper and saw her obit. Her name's Elizabeth Hulsing. And my wife taught her. And I went to my wife, I said, look. And then it was horrible. And then when Zach died, then we heard from Elizabeth's mother, who knew about the HEAT program. And I gotta tell you, I was very skeptical. I asked questions when I was there, because prior to being at the first meeting was the National Overdose Awareness Day. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this. And we had that in Lexington, and I went to this park where they had the National Overdose Awareness Day, and proclamations were read and speeches were given were given, and there was absolutely nothing in the newspaper and absolutely nothing on our local news about it, and it irritated me. I mean, it just irritated me. Nothing was mentioned about it. So when I get this call, or when we go down to this meeting, the then U.S. Attorney, Kerry Harvey, comes in, and my first question is, how are you going to be different than these people? Well, because he walked the walk and talked the talk. He started it. And then it didn't take us long to realize it was the real deal. He wanted to reach the community, and he did. And that's how HEAT started. I don't know how many members we have now, but it's very effective. And again, I say, if you don't have it in your office, why not?
And if I could jump in, I know personally that Colorado, North Carolina, Attorney General Josh Stein, love him. They are bringing together all those, as we talked about in our 6 lines, they're bringing together everyone in the community. We were down there about 6 months ago for a meeting with law enforcement, harm reduction, Duke University, everybody coming together to look at this in a holistic approach. In Colorado, we have Operation Poison Pusher and Operation Warm Handoff. So going after the dealers, but also how do we take care of those that have succumbed to addiction so that we don't have the repeat in the jails, so that we can, rather than arresting, because we can't arrest our way out of this, how we take care of those people. So there are communities, there are states that are coming together and are working through these collaborations, and that's how we're going to get a handle on all of this.
And just to underscore that, when you're sitting in a room in North Carolina with 13 sheriffs and chiefs of police who are studly, strong,
Scare the heck out of you.
law enforcement professionals who are doing a tremendous job down there, and they have decided that just arresting users is not working for them, and they've reached out to the harm reduction community. They're still doing exactly what they should do and going after the dealers really hard, but they're also reaching out to the harm reduction. And when you see those two communities cooperating with each other, it's powerful.
And Kevin, I know you've been doing this a fair number of years. It's got to be difficult, the stories that you see, the prayer cards that you held up, that it takes this emotional toll on law enforcement and the prosecutors, but then on volunteers and folks that are doing this work. You've already had your own tragedies. How do you cope with that, and what can any of y'all say to inspire people who want to get involved? I know it's difficult, but you got to take care of yourself at the same time and insulate yourself and share with us your thoughts on that.
I tell people that we built my brother's house, and I tell people I can build a house and go out and dance at night, but I'm sure Admiral, Mary, Walt, Debbie will attest that when we're done today, we're wiped. It takes everything out of you. Mary Ann is in school right now. She's Special Services School District aide, so she's not here. And but when she's with me, I have to look and I have to, inside, I know that I force her to relive this when we come out and we do these panels. Every time. She's a tough Italian girl. I was with the Attorney General, as I said, in March at the White House, and I came home all excited and told her about it. She says, I don't care whose house you're at, the garbage has to go out. So she keeps me grounded. But something, whether it's your faith, for me, whether it's your support group, something allows you, because I'm by nature weak, and so I wouldn't be able to do this. I know when I was kneeling over my son, giving him CPR, I just kind of looked up. Mary Ann was at his feet crying. And I said, God, I'm not going to be able to handle this. I'm just going to go out behind the shed unless you take this from me. And so I believe that that's what he did, and has allowed me to go out. And when we have a parent who loses, the hardest thing is, I'm never so forward to say, I know what you're going through, Walt, because I don't. I know what I went through. And to feel that that parent now has to go through that, that's the hardest thing.
Yeah, you make a very good point about we all bring something different to this, that even as similar as two situations may be, everybody just approaches it and handles these tragedies in different ways. And I think support groups are so valuable. I know from my 20-some-odd years as a victim's advocate that just having other people who can somewhat identify with your walk and you can just find a common bond and share with each other and build each other up on those difficult days. I think if I can buy just a couple more minutes, I don't know if, I know we have some really great policymakers and prosecutors in the room. I think we may have time if you guys have a burning question or anything that you're wondering you want to ask from this valuable, brilliant panel that we have here. So they've answered all your questions.
Shy group. I can't believe it.
They are shy, aren't they? I hope you will take their advice and develop some of these programs. If you don't have a group like this already operating in your area, I am quite certain you can probably find some willing partners in your communities.
And what I'd like to follow up and just say thank you for having us here, and thank you for what the federal government is doing and what you're doing on the state level. But it's going to take communities, so going all the way down. As we used to say in the military too, it's like I did a lot of work with our wounded warriors, and yes, the federal government has a responsibility to take care of those individuals, but we all have a responsibility. This is truly affecting our way of life going forward. I had the honor of being up at the Adweek to talk to corporations. The American dream is at risk. Our national security is at risk. We have no idea those babies that are born every 20 minutes with needle abstinence syndrome, how that's going to play out in our future. All those young people that are in jail right now that are going to keep rotating out, this is affecting our economy. If we can't approach you any other way, the way that we were built is at risk. What this country was built on.
And I just want to thank Attorney General Sessions and his team and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein for putting this together and the people who organized it. Mm-hmm. And I see a sea of faces out in front of us. You guys are on the front lines of this epidemic, and thanks for what you guys do each and every day. We really appreciate it.
And of course, this is being streamed live, I know, and I hope a lot of folks are watching this across the country and getting some great ideas about how to do this. And I know if you contact the Department of Justice, they can put you in touch with different resources that are out there and make this happen in your communities. We don't have time to waste talk. I mean, we've got to get boots on the ground and folks busy about this, and that's what's been wonderful working in the Department of Justice and seeing that actually happening on all fronts, from the enforcement and in prosecution, but then also, like I said earlier, the grant-making components that are funding a lot of these great programs.
And the great collaboration, because we really need to get at the underlying cause. Again, you know, no one grows up saying, I want to be an addict. No one grows up. My son didn't say, I want to die at age 19. That was not his goal in life at all. So we really need to look at what are the underlying causes. Right now it's opioids, as we've seen in the past, crack cocaine, methamphetamine is on the rise. Vaping is huge. We have no idea what is in that. Fentanyl, it can show up in vaping as well. So we need to look at the underlying causes as well. I know we're trying to solve what's happening and stop the fatalities, but it's really looking at how we get into this situation in the first place.
Well, I'm so appreciative to the four of you, not just for being here today. Of course, we're very grateful for that, but the work that you're doing every day in your communities and just spreading that word, I think is great. Woo! We do have maybe a question.
Well, I just want to say this. I was part of a program, it took over a decade, that reversed, took high school senior drug use down 50%. How many lives were saved by that? And there are three things, we still know the three. Prevention, we've got to keep people from starting on the path. Law enforcement, which really is a component of prevention, but it's important. Don't let people tell you it's not. And thirdly is treatment. So we got more money out now for treatment. We're going to have more prevention programs. But the key to prevention are citizens like these that you've heard from today. They carry that message. It touches people's hearts. And more people know somebody personally who's suffered as a result of this disease. So, Darlene, thank you for putting this together, and thank you all for participating. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our first panel. We'd really like to thank all the panelists for sharing their stories of their loved ones and inspiring us to do better. We're going to take a brief break. The Attorney General has to leave for a scheduled meeting, but we'd like to just invite everybody to give the panelists and the Attorney General a round of applause.
So, a brief break in this summit on the opioid epidemic hosted by the Justice Department. We've heard so far from Attorney General Jeff Sessions announcing new measures to deal with opioid addiction. Also, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein yet to speak. We understand White House advisor Kellyanne Conway is going to make remarks, and we'll have that later for you here live on C-SPAN 2. While we wait for the resumption of this discussion, we'll show you remarks now from Jeff Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, from earlier today.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mary. I need to update my resume. I think I'm at 28 years, almost 29. It's a great honor to be here today. I want to thank Mary, not just for welcoming remarks, but for the exceptional work that she and her entire team did to organize this event today. For those of you watching on TV, we actually have a standing room only crowd here at the Great Hall of Main Justice, which I think illustrates how important this issue is to all of us. Seated on the stage, along with the Attorney General, are our Acting Associate Attorney General, Jesse Panuccio, and our Assistant Attorney General for Legal Policy, Beth Williams. They have both been working diligently on this issue with us. We're also joined in the audience by many of our United States attorneys from throughout the country, districts that are dealing with the opioid challenge, and with other department leaders, as well as public officials and private citizens. I see as well some leaders of our partner law enforcement agencies who have been working with us. And by the way, if you're wondering why many of us are wearing purple today, it's not just a coincidence. We wanted our outfits to match. We're wearing purple today in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month here at the Department of Justice, another important priority for us. On the topic this morning, though, this is the first National Opioid Summit held at the Department of Justice, but it is just one step in a very long line of steps the Attorney General has taken to combat the opioid crisis. We're honored to have many distinguished guests with us today. Our first panel will include men and women who have lost children to the opioid crisis and are turning their grief into action. Very concrete illustration for us of the devastation that the drug overdose epidemic is wreaking throughout the country. Among the panelists are retired U.S. Navy Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, who served as our nation's 9th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his wife, Mary, to share their story with you. We thank Admiral Winnefeld and Mary for their service, and we thank all of the panelists who are working to end the opioid crisis. In August of 1989, on the eve of the 200th anniversary of the Office of the Attorney General, then Attorney General Dick Thornburgh addressed the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association. He was 1 year into his job, and the nation was in the throes of a terrible drug epidemic. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, crack cocaine ravaged our cities, spreading violence, death, and despair. The crack cocaine epidemic led to skyrocketing murder rates in many U.S. cities, including here in Washington, D.C. In 1991, Washington's murder rate peaked at 482 total murders, a rate of 81 homicides per 100,000 residents, and the city became known as the nation's murder capital, exponentially higher than the average throughout the rest of the country. Attorney General Thornburgh reflected on how the department had changed over the 2 centuries since the appointment of the nation's first Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, in 1789. Thornburgh concluded that the Justice Department's fundamental responsibility remained the same: responding to the just expectations of the American people, as articulated by the President and by their elected representatives in the Congress. Those expectations, Thornburgh declared, impose heavy responsibilities on those of us charged with meeting them. And in 1989, Thornburgh observed, Americans expected a maximum effort against drug dealing and drug abuse. Nearly 3 decades later, we once again confront a scourge of devastation caused by drug abuse, this time a different drug. In the late 1990s, companies began marketing prescription pain medication.
Those remarks from the Deputy Attorney General earlier this morning. We are going to return now to live coverage of the Justice Department's discussion today on opioid addiction.
Mr. Panuccio previously served as the Executive Director of the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity and also served as the General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel to the Governor of Florida. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Duke University. In his current role, Mr. Panuccio oversees the Department's Civil Division, its Office of Justice Programs, the Community-Oriented Policing Service, and the Office for Victims of Crime. These are all key DOJ components in combating the epidemic. All of our distinguished panelists oversee their own components or agencies, and I will leave it to Mr. Panuccio to introduce them.
Well, thank you, Mary, for that introduction and for your tireless efforts in helping to address the opioid crisis. It continues to be a privilege to work with you on this urgent priority for the department and for the nation as a whole. I'll get to our panelists. I want to just provide a few opening remarks for the panel. And let me also say many thanks to the panelists we just heard from who are providing the resources and the care for those who suffer from the consequences of this terrible addiction crisis we have, and it grows out of their own personal tragedies and personal crisis, and we're so appreciative for what they do. Now, as you heard, that panel was a lot about treatment and how we care for those who are addicted, but enforcement is the other side of our efforts here. And so we turn from that topic to the issue of how we stem the tide, of how we drive down the illicit production, distribution, and use of opioids. As you've already heard this morning from Attorney General Sessions and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, one of the Justice Department's top priorities is driving down the death toll from opioids. More than 200,000 people have perished in the last 2 decades because of opioid overdoses. Almost a quarter of those deaths, 42,000 of them, occurred in 2016 alone. To put that in perspective, opioid deaths in 2016 outranked automobile fatalities, gun fatalities, and alcohol-induced fatalities. 115 people per day are dying from opioids. That's this entire audience, to put that in some perspective for you. It is just simply staggering to think about. This ghastly death toll is the result of our country having been illegally flooded with prescription opioids, synthetic opioids, and heroin. There are people, companies, and criminal gangs or enterprises responsible for this fatal glut. It is our duty and it is our intention at the Department of Justice to hold them responsible. That applies to the entire supply chain, manufacturers, distributors, doctors, pharmacies, organized crime, and street dealers. Those who have spent years violating this nation's drug laws to profit off of addiction and death are going to be held accountable. The department will bring to this fight all of its tools and resources. Criminal prosecutions will continue to be a large part of our effort. We will indict and aggressively prosecute those who manufacture, import, and sell heroin and synthetic opioids, and we will likewise prosecute doctors and pharmacists who misuse their controlled substance registrations in the distribution of prescription opioids. We will also use the full arsenal of the department's civil enforcement authorities. For example, the False Claims Act provides the department with a powerful tool to pursue all of those in the opioid distribution chain that are responsible for improper marketing, distribution, prescription, and diversion. Much of our work in this area is not yet public, but I can assure you that a reckoning is coming for those who have defrauded the government in the course of profiting from opioids. Another important example of civil enforcement is an ongoing, cooperative effort by the Consumer Protection Branch here at Maine Justice and several U.S. Attorney offices to invoke the injunctive relief provisions of the Controlled Substances Act to halt illegal prescribing by doctors and pharmacists. The Northern District of Ohio announced the first of these cases this past summer. The Consumer Protection Branch is also exploring the use of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in these areas, in these cases. Doctors and pharmacists need to be on the front lines of stemming this crisis. They need to prescribe responsibly and lawfully. And if they do not, we have the tools to hold them accountable. One set of commentators described these recent cases from the Northern District of Ohio as the department getting creative and aggressive, that the department has rediscovered a potentially powerful tool and has now shown it is willing to use it. That is absolutely correct. And the commentator was right to warn anyone at all connected to the opioid business to take heed of what we are doing. Cases like these will give our attorneys the tools to stop bad actors before or during prosecution, or even when the evidence falls short of what is necessary to bring a criminal case. These new tools supplement others that have traditionally been the mainstay of civil enforcement under the Controlled Substances Act. We will continue to bring actions for civil monetary penalties of up to $62,500 for each errant prescription and up to $14,500 for each record-keeping violation involving controlled substances. These penalties can and often do result in civil complaints seeking millions of dollars in penalties. They provide a powerful incentive for controlled substances registrants to follow closely federal regulations. At the same time, the DEA will continue to bring administrative actions to revoke the controlled substance registration of doctors and pharmacists who flout the rules. And DEA diversion investigators and tactical diversion squads will continue to conduct inspections and investigations that provide the evidence for all of these enforcement tools. In sum, the Department of Justice is employing every resource we have, criminal, civil, and administrative, to combat the opioid crisis. We want the message to be clear, to be very clear. Those causing this crisis will be brought to justice. We have here today a very distinguished panel to discuss our enforcement efforts. They are uniquely qualified. Each of their extended bios, I could probably spend 10 or 15 minutes on the careers of each of these individuals. Their extended bios are in your materials, so I will refer you to those and offer only a brief introduction so we can get to the substance. We are joined today by Brian Benchikowski, the Assistant Attorney General for the Department's Criminal Division, and he will discuss Maine Justice's criminal enforcement efforts. We are joined by Justin Herdman, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, who will discuss some of the criminal cases his office has brought, as well as the pioneering civil work and cases from this summer that I just mentioned. We are also joined by Udom Dillon, the Acting Administrator of the DEA, who will discuss the important work that his agency has done identifying doctors and pharmacists who break the law, the DEA's investigative resources, and the administrative process the DEA has at its disposal to revoke controlled substance registrations. And we are joined by David Bowditch, the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he will discuss the Bureau's cooperation with the DEA and with local law enforcement to gather the evidence we use to combat the opioid crisis through enforcement. Gentlemen, thanks to each of you for joining us for this important panel. I'll open it up with a question that would be for everyone. If you could discuss in perhaps 5 minutes each, and I know this is a big question for 5 minutes, but how are your agencies or components contributing to the department's overall effort to curtail the opioid epidemic? And let me just try to focus that for each of you. Brian, perhaps you could address the components in the criminal division, how they use their various expertise. Justin, if you could highlight what you've done with Operation Synthetic Opioid Surge. Udom, if you could discuss this Saturday's big drug take-back day. And David, if you could highlight any of the differences in the FBI's dealing with the prescription painkiller, prescriptions versus the fentanyl or synthetic opioids. So why don't we just go down the line? Udom, if you'd like to begin, that'd be great.
Thank you, Jesse. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today to represent the brave men and women of the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is an important week for DEA. This Saturday, October 27th, is National Prescription Drug Take-Back Day. It is from 10 to 2, and it will be at locations all across the country, a collection of locations all across the country. It's the day we encourage all Americans to look in their medicine cabinets and pull out all of those prescription drugs they're not using and go to that collection location near them and deposit them for safe and secure disposal. Anybody who's watching this who wants to know where to go, all they need to do is to go to deatakeback.com and you will find a location near you. There's over 5,000 locations throughout the country that will be receiving prescription medications this Saturday from 10 to 2. It's really important to do this. So many Americans have become addicted to the medicines in their medicine cabinets. So getting those medicines out, properly disposing them is critical. Since we started this program in 2010, we have collected almost 10 million pounds of medications. We do it twice a year, and our last one was in April, and we collected about over 900,000 pounds. So we're hoping to at least match that, if not obtain more or collect more this Saturday. The second thing I want to mention, because the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General talked about how prevention is a part of enforcement. That's one element of prevention that DEA focuses on, which is the Take-Back Day. This is Red Ribbon Week. This is a very important week for the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is a week when we remember the special agent, DEA special agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, who was brutally murdered by Mexican drug traffickers 33 years ago. So every year at this time, we remember Agent Camarena's ultimate sacrifice. And we also have programs throughout the country, throughout schools, where we teach students, we educate students about the dangers of drug addiction. We ask them to take a pledge not to become addicted to drugs. So this is a good time for this opioid summit, because this is a really important time for DEA in terms of our prevention model. I'll just say briefly what we're doing from an enforcement perspective very quickly. We are increasing the number of special agents. We are adding task force officers. We've authorized 400 more task force officers. The Attorney General has increased the number of federal prosecutors who will be prosecuting drug cases. DEA is focused completely and totally on fighting the opioid crisis from both the prevention area that we just discussed, as well as full force on the enforcement. Our job is to disrupt, dismantle, and destroy drug trafficking organizations, and we are completely focused on that mission.
Thank you, Administrator. Appreciate that. Deputy Director, would you like to address the issue?
I would. Thank you all. Thank you for allowing me to address you today. I represent the FBI, Director Wray, and 37,000 men and women who work worldwide to keep this nation safe. This is one facet of our mission, and we obviously work with everyone at this table and their people throughout the world on this problem. Sometimes I will step back in a highly complex issue, and I'll say to myself, if you look at the way things work, I'll say, we've been here before. Can I say that about this problem? I don't know. But we have had major drug issues before in this country, and we have found a way to address them to the best of our ability. Now, let's be clear, we are only a piece of this solution. We recognize that, because as long as the demand is here, you will have drugs coming into this country, but we have a responsibility to do everything that we can to mitigate that, and to the point that was made earlier, hold people accountable. So we in the FBI, we focus on a number of things, which, first of all, we work with our partners at the state and local level very closely, as well as our other federal partners, and in this case, mostly with the DEA and some with Department of Homeland Security as well. But the DEA is from the Department of Justice. They are the lead on drug investigations, but we work very closely and hand with them. We do this to address the transnational criminal organizations. Now, some of those organizations start in Mexico in this case, and I'm going to talk about synthetic opioids to include fentanyl. Fentanyl, I know you all have probably discussed this, and I don't want to retread old ground for you, but the origin of the vast majority of it is China. It comes to Mexico, and then it comes into this country, or it comes through the mail into this country. That is our entry, those are our entry points, and there are more. Our concern, if you go back to the meth problem, this is why I say sometimes there's nothing new under the sun. It was started in the canyons, really, of California and probably a few other places, but it eventually evolved into being produced down in the super labs in Mexico, and that's when it became much more efficient and much more productive for the trafficking groups. Once they get it here, then it goes to the street gangs, and the street gangs will distribute it. Or in this case, it will go to your networks that are focused on these particular problems. Those are multiple points where we can interject and work hand in hand with our partners to ensure we try to address those networks and hold them accountable for bringing this dangerous substance into our country. We do have concerns that the same thing could happen here. The fentanyl is produced, much of it in China again. Could you see some of these super labs being multi-purpose down in Mexico? Absolutely. That's our fear, because that would make it probably more plentiful to come into the country. So we have a massive massive job ahead of us, but we will continue to work hand in hand. But again, I recognize for those in the room that we are simply one piece of this solution. To better address the original question I was asked, we do have what's called a prescription drug initiative, which focuses purely on criminal enterprises that are engaged in prescription drug schemes. That's fairly easy. Your enterprises, if you look at them, if you look at a gang or a drug cartel, they're all going to have sales arms, they're going to have enforcement arms, they're going to have guns, they're going to have money laundering. The prescription drug scheme networks may have a little less of the violence, but they will have the same. They run like a business, sometimes a disorganized business, but they do run like a business like any other organization. Second thing we are doing, or the next thing we are doing, is working on the dark web, the distribution networks. This is a very prevalent area in which we have had a number of successes to address the trafficking of synthetic opioids in particular on the dark net, and it's very concerning. And we have a lot of undercovers, we have a lot of efforts afoot down there so that we can continue to address this issue. And then finally, we work with the DEA very closely on an education project where we produced a couple videos for the public consumption, and we found those to be relatively effective. It's difficult to measure the true effectiveness of it, but we do receive a lot of comments. But that was those were jointly produced videos, and that were designed purely to educate. With that, turn it over.
Thank you. Assistant Attorney General Benchikowski.
Thank you, Jesse. It's fair to say there is no higher priority in the criminal division than this issue right now. The President and the Attorney General have set the tone, and that alone would be enough under normal circumstances to elevate this to the top of the list. But for me, this issue is a little bit personal. My father spent 30 years of his career in both the public and private sectors, including more than 20 years here in the District of Columbia in the field of prevention and treatment of addiction. So I'm very, very proud of not only his record, but also to have the ability to lead the men and women of the criminal division on the law enforcement side of this equation. The criminal division is a big place. We have many different sections. Those sections are aligned very well to address the variety of ways that opioids are manufactured, distributed, and trafficked in the United States. We have our narcotics and dangerous drugs section, which works hand in hand with United States attorneys' offices around the country, as well as our organized crime and gang section, both of whom attack almost every day exclusively large drug trafficking organizations, including the organizations that are trafficking heroin and fentanyl into the United States from China and Mexico. Our computer crime and intellectual property section is working furiously to attack the problem of fentanyl distribution in places like the dark web on the internet. Probably most importantly, and the highest profile initiative involves our fraud section. The Attorney General announced this morning a task force that will be led by, he said a dozen, I think we're probably going to have more than that, a dozen plus experienced federal prosecutors who are going to go into 5 states and 9 judicial districts in Appalachia, partner with our U.S. attorneys' offices around the country to bring experienced prosecutors to bear to work side by side with U.S. attorneys' offices in those affected districts to target doctors, to target pharmacies, to target healthcare professionals that are spreading this disease and this addiction and this poison in those communities. And the way it will work is the way it's always worked. We bring a strike force model to bear in these states. We send in at the request of United States attorneys, and with respect to the strike force that was announced today, I had an opportunity, I and my deputy, to speak to all 9 United States attorneys before we decided to do this, and we had unbelievably enthusiastic support from all 9 U.S. attorneys for us to come into the districts and work with them to prosecute cases in one of the most deeply affected and hardest hit parts of the country. And the way we do it is through, in addition to the typical hard work that prosecutors do, working with our federal law enforcement partners to make cases, we use modern technology, data analytics, to mine a variety of data, Medicare and Medicaid data, and other data that give us a very good sense of who the highest risk outlier physicians and pharmacies are in these communities, so that when we go in, we're not there making cases where it takes 2 and 3 years. We're able to do these things in a matter of months, because the sooner you can take off these doctors and others who are spreading prescription opioids in these communities, those are lives that are saved when you do these cases much more quickly. So that's an overview of what we do in the criminal division. The hallmark of what we do under my leadership, and it's been the criminal division's approach over the years, but I think we're taking an even greater approach to this going forward, is making sure that we are the best partners we can possibly be with our U.S. attorney colleagues in the field. Justin and I had an opportunity to work on a case, I think, that he'll talk about, our offices, which is a great example of collaboration between the criminal division and the U.S. attorney's office. We're going to be the best partners we can possibly be with the field. I see a lot of U.S. attorneys in the audience, and we look forward to working with you on all of these cases. Wherever you'll have us, we'll be the best partners we can possibly be.
Brian, thank you. I just want to follow up with one issue. On these strike force models, at least on the civil side, from the side of the House, I see cooperation with local law enforcement sometimes in building evidence in this area is important. Is that a part of these models? What role do you see for local law enforcement?
It is. I think that we should utilize the things that work. And so we work not only with the DEA and the FBI and HHS, OIG, but we strongly encourage our local U.S. attorneys to utilize local law enforcement in these matters wherever they'll are willing to participate. So we absolutely want that to continue. I don't think we could make these cases without state and local support.
Okay, thank you. And U.S. Attorney Herdman, Justin, would you like to?
Thank you. I just want to say at the outset, I'm honored to be here on behalf of our United States attorney community. I know several of my colleagues are here, and I think it really does demonstrate to all of us how important this is. It is in our backyard. I mean, there are 93 of us across the country. The stories that we heard on the first panel from Walt, from the Winnefelds, and from Kevin, those are stories that we've heard in our communities. We are of our communities, and we are there to protect our communities and when you think about those stories that were told in that first panel, the fact that they're replicated 72,000 times last year in each of our districts, it's something that I don't have to say it, but I will say it, we are absolutely committed to addressing it. And when you think of the fact that almost all of those 72,000 deaths were the result of some sort of illegal or criminal conduct, it calls for an enforcement strategy that we can employ and we can implement in our districts. One of the opportunities that we've been given from the Department of Justice with the resources we've been provided through OCDF is in 10 pilot districts. It's called Operation SOS, Synthetic Opioid Surge. 10 of us were selected to implement this pilot program, and it's districts that span from New England, Maine, and New Hampshire, all the way to the Eastern District of California. I saw Greg Scott here from the Eastern District of California. And then there's a cluster of districts right in the heartland of America, both districts in Ohio, both districts in West Virginia, the Western District of Pennsylvania, the Eastern District of Kentucky, and the Eastern District of Tennessee. And I know, I think almost all of my colleagues from those districts are here. And that really illustrates, I think, the impact in each of our communities of this opioid crisis. And what we have committed to doing out of our offices is selecting one county within our districts where we will prosecute every readily provable opioid case involving fentanyl, involving an analog. We don't see very much heroin anymore, but if we have heroin, we'll prosecute that too. We've got to do them all out of these particular counties. And there's a reason for that. You heard the Attorney General speak about the fact that we didn't think of this. It was actually first implemented by one of our U.S. Attorney colleagues in the Middle District of Florida in Manatee County, and the results that they witnessed were outstanding. A drop of up to 77% in overdoses over the course of the project that they implemented down there, a drop of 74% in overdose fatalities. So our objective here in each of our districts is to drive the death rate down. And we can do that by attacking fentanyl dealers and fentanyl suppliers. My colleague Christina Nolan is here from the District of Vermont. I've heard her say this several times, and I've co-opted it. If somebody is dealing fentanyl, they may as well be dealing cyanide or arsenic. It is absolutely poison. And where people are profiting from selling that poison in all of our districts, we're committed to bringing them to justice. The county we selected in the Northern District of Ohio is Lorain County. It's immediately west of Cleveland. It's a county of about 300,000 people. Former steel mill county, had some auto plants. It suffered economically like much of the rest of our region, but has also suffered from the opioid crisis. In 2016 and 2017, the county witnessed about 130 deaths per year as a result of overdoses, almost all of which were related to opioids. The death rate in Lorain County is the 7th highest in our district of 40 counties in northern Ohio. And so we selected that county because we thought it was a place that we could make an above average impact by implementing this program. We also had, this is very important, and I know all my U.S. Attorney colleagues who are implementing this program have thought along the same lines, very, very close relationships with our county prosecutor in Lorain County and our local law enforcement. We have worked really tightly with the Elyria and Lorain police departments over the years as a result of great federal cooperation through the FBI and through the DEA. So it was definitely a place that we thought we could make an impact. We rolled our own version of Operation SOS out in July, right when the Attorney General announced this. Since then, we've charged 24 people out of Lorain County for dealing almost exclusively fentanyl, but also fentanyl analogs, and some fentanyl that was laced in pills. Of those 24, and this is where I think you can really start to see the impact of this program, of those 24, 15 of them were out on bond for county-level drug trafficking offenses. So these are people that had been arrested multiple times, had been released from the local courts, were back out on the street and dealing. And we were able to take them off the street and get them detained. All of our defendants have been detained thus far out of Operation SOS. So that's 24 people that aren't dealing fentanyl anymore in Lorain County. They are detained, they are awaiting trial, some of them have pled. Another thing that's really important to point out is that of these 24 people that we have arrested, 15 of them are also career offenders. So these are people who are facing very significant penalties, decades in prison under the U.S. sentencing guidelines because of their criminal history. And again, these are cases that we may not otherwise have taken because they involve a very low threshold of sales that are involved. Another critical component, and something that we see in all of these cases, is the intersection with violent crime. Again, we've arrested 24 people so far since July. 5 of them had firearms and ammunition on them at the time of their federal arrest. So again, they're out on the street, they're on bond, or they're on some kind of supervision. We arrest them for a new drug case, and they have firearms, including last week a gentleman who had an AK-47 on him when he was arrested pursuant to a federal arrest warrant. So we feel very good about the progress that we've made thus far. We are really encouraged by some of the preliminary numbers that we've seen. Again, the objective is to drive down the death rate in this selected geographic region. We feel very good about what we've seen so far. We're going to keep pushing forward on it, and we're very encouraged with the support that we're getting from the department on this project.
Great, thank you, Justin. And let me turn the next question specifically to you. You've got some experience, some great experience using different tools in parallel, whether it's criminal investigative tools that you've just discussed or civil injunction suits that I mentioned earlier, the path-breaking suits that you and the Consumer Protection Branch brought. Can you offer some thoughts, especially for the U.S. attorneys that are here or those that are watching, on the practicalities, the challenges, the benefits of using parallel proceedings?
I think it's actually, it's an absolutely critical component of what we are obligated to do out of our offices. If you have a law enforcement tool that's on the shelf in a crisis like this, you better take it down and dust it off and figure out how you're going to use it. And that's exactly what we've tried to do across all of our attorneys in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Whether you're in the civil space, whether you're in the criminal space, this is all hands on deck. Everybody's a part of the solution here. And so what that enables us to do, when you've got a civil prosecutor and a criminal prosecutor who are sitting at the same table talking about a district-wide strategy, it enables us to come up with, just as you said before, Jesse, really creative solutions to a problem that is unprecedented. And that's what we're going to need more of if we're going to get our way through this. So what we will do is we've developed a list of various targets, and we will go through them line by line and look at, from both a civil perspective and a criminal perspective, how we can develop an investigation into any one of these targets, and then come up with a strategy related to each individual target. Some of them are worked jointly, some of them are worked individually by our criminal prosecutors, some of them are worked individually by our civil prosecutors. And this framework has allowed us to move more quickly than we otherwise would have. The cases that we filed over the summer were cases that we saw an imminent need to seek injunctive relief from our courts to prevent further prescribing from doctors who truly had thrown any sort of idea of care for their patients out the window. They were overprescribing, or they were just flat out selling narcotics and controlled substances for cash. So it was something we felt like we needed to move quickly, and the Controlled Substances Act and the injunctive relief available under that act enabled us to move much more briskly than if we had tried to build a case through the grand jury and indicted folks. It allowed us to move almost right away. So that was very exciting. It was a great opportunity, but we couldn't have done it without the teamwork from both our civil and our criminal prosecutors.
Thank you. And one thing I'll just stress, and maybe you want to provide a brief comment, is when you're working with parallel proceedings, the AG often likes to say 85% of law enforcement is local, and as I mentioned to Brian, sometimes in building the evidence for these cases or doing the reviews, local coroners, local state licensing boards can all be important to these efforts as well. And it's just something to keep in mind when you're dealing with parallel proceedings. That often means parallel in the federal government, but also working with local partners and their different administrative tools to gather that evidence. Administrator Dillon, let me ask you, it's kind of a similar question. The DEA has criminal tools at its disposal. It has administrative tools at its disposal. Can you discuss the intersection of those and the importance of using both of them?
Yes. First, let me actually make a point about collaboration. We could not do our jobs without working closely with our federal partners and our state and local partners. So I want to echo what everyone said about how important collaboration is to drug enforcement. On the administrative side, DEA does several things. First, DEA sets quotas for the amount of controlled substances that manufacturers can manufacture every year. We have been reducing those quotas significantly. The idea here is supply matters, and what we don't want is more addictive drugs available than are actually needed for medical purposes and research purposes. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we have now reduced the quotas for these drugs about 44%. It's important from our perspective to always ensure that those medications are available for those who actually need them, that there's never a shortage. But it's also important for us to ensure that those quotas are at a level where diversion of large numbers of prescription medications, controlled substances, cannot occur. The other thing we do is an enforcement side with respect to a registrant. A registrant is anybody who is registered with the Drug Enforcement Administration to handle controlled substances. This goes from manufacturers, everyone from a manufacturer who can make a drug to a distributor who can distribute it, to a pharmacist, to your family physician. These people are all registrants. And one of our enforcement tools is to look at whether they are properly handling controlled substances. A classic case would be a doctor who is prescribing opioids to somebody who does not need them, where it's not medically necessary. We've seen that, unfortunately, on a number of occasions. Pharmacists who are actually giving opioids or selling those to those who don't have prescriptions. When we see that, we can take an administrative action against those individuals, and we can essentially take away their registration so they can no longer handle controlled substances. So those are two of the ways that, on the regulatory side, that DEA is attacking the opioid crisis.
Thank you. Brian, let me turn back to you. You mentioned the criminal division has a variety of tools. One of them is asset forfeiture work. It seems like an important aspect of this problem. I'm wondering if you could just discuss that a little bit and give us a few examples of how that's playing out in practice.
Absolutely. So yet another section in the criminal division, the money laundering and asset recovery section. It's a group of lawyers and analysts whose job it is really to take the profit out of criminal activity by tracing, seizing, and forfeiting the proceeds of crime. And they work across a number of areas, from the traditional types of money laundering that you typically see in large-scale drug organizations, so bulk cash going back across the border into Mexico. When it gets seized by our law enforcement partners at the border, it's oftentimes our lawyers who do the legal work to seize that cash and forfeit it. Same thing with trade-based money laundering, which is taking dirty money and working it into a legitimate business and washing it around. Our lawyers and analysts working with our law enforcement partners look at those types of occurrences in order to attack cartels, local drug organizations, and others who are trying to move the cash from their illicit activity and be able to continue to use it. But one of the things we're seeing more of now with the advent of the use of the dark web to transmit, to sell fentanyl, analogs, and precursor chemicals is the use of cryptocurrencies and other high-tech means for moving value around the world. That has become increasingly more difficult to address, but our lawyers in MLARs and analysts, along with the folks in the computer crime and intellectual property section, the sort of the techie, geeky lawyers that we have in the criminal division, are working together to figure out how to crack the problem of cryptocurrency and the use of cryptocurrencies to move value in connection with these transactions. And finally, we have a bank integrity unit in the criminal division that looks at financial institutions to make sure that financial institutions are doing everything they possibly can and to meet their obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act, to know their customers, to know their customers' businesses. So when money is moved into financial institutions, they're filing the proper paperwork with the federal government, including suspicious activity reports, which we then mine for leads and look for opportunities to follow the money back into the criminal system in order to attack the flows that way. So those are just a couple of ways that we use our assets in the criminal division to attack, as I said, the profits of criminal activity, because in addition to going after individuals and wanting to prosecute individuals, I think it's incumbent upon us, and the Attorney General has been very clear about this to me in the 3 months that I've been on the job. It isn't just find the criminals and prosecute them and lock them up, but he's also said on repeated occasions, we absolutely need to follow the money, and we're going to continue to do that.
Thank you. Deputy Director Badich, let me turn back to you. A steep rise in illicit drug sales on the dark net, as we know, and we heard from one of the panelists earlier that the lethal dose actually came, for his son, came from the dark net. So with that rise and the rise of transnational organized crime, can you discuss a little bit about how the Bureau works with international partners and stakeholders in this space?
I can. So I touched on a little bit of this earlier, so take the street gangs out of it. Those are the folks that push it into the country. There's two cartels that are really controlling or have the most heroin production, and that's CJ&G, Calizo Generation Nuevo Cartel, or I'm going to get it mixed up. CJ&G, I'll get it to you later, but and Sinaloa Cartel. Those are the two cartels that are really rampant in poppy production as well as heroin distribution right now. There's many more cartels, but we work closely with our partners. We also have offices overseas that we are working on this problem with, where we are hand in hand with our partners. When it comes to the dark net, we do, I don't want to get too much in depth on that, but we do have undercover operations going on the dark net, where we are trying to identify and track the networks. So as I mentioned earlier, a network and an enterprise is a network. The only thing that really changes is their techniques, tactics, and procedures. That is what's changed. So we have had to evolve with them to help track them. As far as the international relationships and how that helps, it is essential today. And I don't care if it's this crime or any other crime, but in this crime, that's why we're here, it is absolutely essential because these products do not emanate from the U.S. Now, we've seen minor attempts here, but these products are emanating from other countries, as we discussed earlier. So I think pressure on some of these countries to continue to work together and even go further than that is going to be very, very important. I will tell you this from a non-political position, a career position. We have an attorney general right now who we meet with multiple times a week, and he is consistently asking, what are we doing for this problem? He is absolutely emphasizing this. My point in telling you this is not some political show here. This is very near and dear to his heart, and he is putting a tremendous amount of influence, which essentially expands to other parts of government and the interagency, which is very, very important. For how this problem is emphasized and is resourced, quite frankly. Our focus on the transnational side is working with those partners that I mentioned earlier, with the Mexico, China, some of the Central American countries and others, to ensure that we have the best relationships we can build, and that we do ensure that everybody understands we all have skin in this game. Now, sometimes those are built through very close relationships. Other times there's a little leverage that can be applied, but either way, we need to work together on the problem, and we will continue. The dark web there's dark web and there's clear web. Some of these materials, these synthetic opioids, are also sold on the clear web, which is essentially the internet. Most of that is in powder form, and it's easier to find them. The dark web is really, it's the wild, wild west, and it is something that I don't want to get too deep into our procedures on that and how we do our business, but it's a very important element because we have seen a lot that has been trafficked through there.
Thank you, and I think you're right to say there is a consistent message from the top, from the Attorney General, that we are seeking to drive the death toll down right now. That is why everyone here is so committed, why we're using creative tactics, using statutes that, provisions we haven't used before. The overriding goal is to drive that death toll down. Let me ask one final question. We're running short on time, so I'll ask each of you to address this in about a minute or so. But as you all know on this stage, earlier this year, the Attorney General announced the Prescription Interdiction and Litigation Task Force, and that is an umbrella under which we're conducting a lot of this work. And one of the focuses will be the use of data analytics. And Brian mentioned this briefly in his comments, but if you could all discuss just briefly, how do you employ data analytics? How are they useful to solving this crisis? I think people are familiar, for example, with the way data analytics are used to fight street crime in major cities and issues like that. But now we're taking some of those tactics and adapting them to the opioid crisis. Why don't we start, Justin, with you, and then
Sure.
we'll just let everybody speak for about a minute coming down the line.
Well, we are avid consumers of data out of our U.S. Attorney's Office, and we're very fortunate. I think if you want to use this to your advantage, you really need to have somebody who not only understands the data, but just loves to look at it. So we have that person. She's actually a civil AUSA in our office, and lives and breathes the data and portrays it in a way for us that makes sense and that we can develop strategies around it. But it is critical for us to not only identify targets out of the data, but to understand somebody who may look like an outlier for some reason. There are legitimate explanations sometimes for why somebody would be an outlier on the data. And if you have somebody who is proficient with the data, is knowledgeable and conversant in the data, and can explain it to people who are less so, like myself, you're absolutely doing what I think we need to do at the directive of the Attorney General, which is identify the people who are really driving the crisis in the wrong direction and come up with a strategy to take them out.
Thank you, Brian.
So in the criminal division, and I would echo everything that Justin just said, we have a particular team in the fraud section led by a wonderful woman named Naomi Adenaya, who takes all of this data, and it's across the board. It's Medicare and Medicaid data, it's prescriber data, it's financial data, it's data on opioid deaths connected to particular physicians. I mean, it is a real sort of soup pot of data. And Naomi takes it and analyzes it and is able to look district by district across the country and produces, based on that data, targeting packages for the U.S. Attorney's offices, which allow us to be much more efficient in the use of our prosecutorial and investigative resources, because we have this advanced data that tells us in the first instance where to look. I think Justin's point is a good one. Sometimes it also tells us, well, this might be the right place to look, or it might look like the right place to look in the first instance, but it really isn't. And so the level of efficiency that we're able to bring to bear in the use of our resources, which then leads to quicker investigations, quicker indictments, quicker prosecutions, and quicker pleas. And I'll give you one example. There's a doctor named Roberto Fernandez in the Southern District of Florida, and he was selling opioid prescriptions to Medicare patients for about $100 to $200 a prescription. And from the time that we investigated to the time of his sentencing was 10 months. He got 97 months in prison for the amount of opioids that he put on the street. It took us less than 10 months to go from identifying him to getting him sentenced and locked up. And it's the data that allows us to do that.
I'll give you a high-level answer on the data analysis. Essentially, we are hiring more and more data scientists, which we are competing with every other government agency out there to do so, because we recognize the inflow of data and the ability to digest, consume, and disseminate what is necessary that comes out of that it's almost undoable right now. It's almost unsustainable. So we're trying to hire more and more folks with that skill set. The second thing is we search for clusters in working with our state and local partners. So we will oftentimes deploy our intelligence analysts out into some of the state and local venues and have them work together with them. I think it's important to recognize that in the state and local problem, there's between 18,000 and 19,000 police departments out there. We think of the NYPDs, the LAPDs, and the small and medium, but there's a lot of very small departments that have clusters in their area that are not well prepared or resourced to address it. That's how we will bring in those resources and try to identify clusters and then work with them and with the DEA and with our partners to address that issue. And then finally, I would say searching for the anomalies, particularly on the healthcare fraud side. This is where you will, to Mr. Benchkowski's point earlier, this is where you will identify some of these physicians that are abusing their licenses and that are abusing, quite frankly, their control over these narcotics. I saw it was recently presented a case down south where an individual walked into a doctor's office. The doctor looked at him literally for about 30 seconds, and he looked at him and he said, "You have neck pain, right?" And the guy said, "Yeah." And he said, "We've got to be careful." That doctor was doing this for thousands of people. Now, the vast majority of these medical professionals are incredibly diligent and they're doing the right thing for society. But there are abusers out there, and the data allows us to identify those anomalies and then attack them, attack that problem, and then ultimately hold them accountable.
Thank you, Administrator Dillon.
So on the administrative side, one way we use data analytics is just what the Deputy Director was talking about. We look at, for example, a pharmacy, and we look at where people are coming from to get their prescriptions filled. And you might see a rural pharmacy or a pharmacy that's not located in a heavily populated area, and you'll see people traveling hundreds of miles for hours to get to that pharmacy. Why would anybody travel that far? The answer is that tells us that that pharmacy is a place that's very friendly to certain folks who have certain types of prescriptions or maybe don't have prescriptions at all. So that's just one of the ways that we use data to identify those folks who are registered by the DEA and who are improperly distributing prescription drugs.
Thank you very much. I want to thank this panel, and I would just note, you're looking at 4 people up here who are at the front lines of addressing this crisis, but they're really representing the hundreds of people that work for them that are getting up every day and thinking about how we meet the challenge the President and the Attorney General have set for the department, which is to drive the death toll down. And I know many people here in this audience and at home or watching this streaming are doing that as well. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of the men and women of law enforcement that you represent. Appreciate everybody's attention to this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Stuff. Yeah. Right down the hall. Shut the mic. You want to try this? I think they killed the mics.
No, I've got it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll try to stay as close to on schedule as we can. If everybody could just be seated for panel 3. I'd like to introduce our third panel. It's called The Evolution of the Crisis and Challenges on the Horizon. And I will moderate this panel with 3 of our resident experts here at the department to discuss the enforcement challenges we're facing today. And I'll introduce them in order. Matthew Cronin is an assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Ohio, where he focuses on prosecuting transnational criminal organizations and drug and money laundering crimes occurring over the darknet. He is a lead prosecutor on some of the department's most significant darknet cases, including the Zhang case, a case announced by the Attorney General just this past August. In that case, the department charged leaders of one of China's largest synthetic drug trafficking organizations who distributed fentanyl analogs that resulted in deaths of U.S. citizens. Michelle Corver is the Department of Justice's first ever digital currency counsel. She works in the Criminal Division's Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section. She has more than 25 years of law enforcement experience, and she is a subject matter expert on cases involving cryptocurrency and provides legal advice on prosecutorial and forfeiture best practices to attorneys, investigators, and regulators. Finally, MJ Menendez is the Heroin and Fentanyl Projects Coordinator for our Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Forces. Ms. Menendez is on detail to OCDF from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Colorado, where she served as an AUSA for 12 years. She also previously served as a state district court judge in Colorado and a longtime state court prosecutor. Ms. Menendez is helping the department solve a whole host of problems relating to the opioid epidemic, to include expediting the identification and analysis of synthetic opioids and other new psychoactive substances. So please welcome our panelists. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to ask Matt if he can talk a little bit about how drug trafficking has evolved with our new technology and how it's become more dangerous.
Yeah, sure. First, good morning, everybody. And before I get going, I want to thank the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, their respective staff for putting this event together. I also want to thank everyone here for all the hard work that I know you're doing combating the opioid crisis. I know that sometimes it might seem like a bit of an abstraction, numbers and figures, but I can tell you as someone on the front lines who's investigating these cases, prosecuting these cases, sitting in the room with grieving parents and grieving relatives, what you're doing is truly making a difference. So on behalf of the front line, thank you. All right, so what we're talking about today are emerging threats, and I was asked in particular to focus on how these different technologies are changing the nature of drug trafficking. And to get going on that, what I want to do first was to play out a scenario that, if statistics are to be believed, is happening every week, if not every day, in most districts around the country. A young man sits down in front of a computer. He logs in using a Tor browser to a darknet marketplace. There, within 5 minutes or so, he finds and orders, say, 10 grams or so of carfentanil or a similarly dangerous synthetic opioid for $5,000 or so, paid for in Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency. A laboratory in China fulfills the order, and through the standard smuggling routes, it goes directly to this young man's front door. Now think about that for a second. For about 5 minutes of work and $5,000, this young man has ordered approximately 500,000 lethal doses of narcotics that went directly to his home. Now, odds are his plan is not to try to hurt anyone. He wants to make money. And if he properly cuts those narcotics, which is a big if, and part of the reason for the deaths, he can make potentially millions of dollars, a tremendous return on investment. So the first question we have to be asking is, why is this happening? Why is this happening now? Why is it happening in greater frequency? And the answer is technological innovation and profit motive, or greed. This here is called the diffusion of innovation model. It's an economic theory. And basically what it says is that when a killer app, an amazing new technology, device, procedure enters a marketplace that offers a user's new abilities or efficiencies, it'll eventually supplant everything that came before it. So an example of everyday life would include the internet and smartphone. Early on, essentially no one used them. Nowadays, you're very weird if you don't use them, right? So we're seeing something similarly happening, unfortunately, in the criminal marketplace, so to speak. These are a series of killer apps, both literally and figuratively, that have entered the criminal marketplace around the same time. You have the Tor browser and the darknet, and for those of you interested, that's a mosaic map of the darknet put together by a third party. Each of those thousands of white dots are criminal websites. So what that gives you is internet anonymity, or at least perceived anonymity. You can use the internet without fear of consequence, and you can put up hidden servers containing criminal conduct, again, through at least perceived lack of consequence. Next up, you have the next series of killer apps is end-to-end encryption. So it gives you communications anonymity. the going dark problem. And that means that there's at least a sense that criminals can communicate with one another freely. You don't have to worry about law enforcement retaliation. Then finally, you have cryptocurrencies, and Michelle will talk about that in more detail, which gives, at least again, perceived transactional anonymity. Criminals believe they can use this, they can transact with one another and launder their money without law enforcement getting involved because there's no central authority involved in the transaction. There's no bank, there's no Federal Reserve. And then this is the last killer app, which I think everyone here has seen this slide in some capacity if you've done anything with the opioid crisis. And it always talks about lethality. And that's true, but there's more to it than that, right? Because what this slide also shows you is how little you need to produce and how little you need to smuggle to get a similar amount of potent drugs into the United States. And that again makes a difference. So put all of these different killer apps together and see how you can see, based upon simple incentives, how criminals are changing. This is an extremely simplified model of kind of the current mass drug distribution system. So in reality, each of those squares and circles probably has 10 to 20 steps, but it involves a lot of, it's very complex, it involves a lot of steps, it involves a lot of people you have to pay, it's expensive. Now, think about a new system, which is what I put together, where you have a synthetic laboratory in China that just needs to get some precursors, have some lab techs. You don't need hundreds of acres of farmland. And they can send the drugs, highly potent drugs, over either directly to a consumer or through an intermediary in the darknet. And they pay for it and launder their money through cryptocurrencies. And this new system, for a variety of reasons, is what's driving a lot of the deaths. So that, and I will say here, going back to this diffusion of innovation model, that's my guesstimate, my educated sense of approximately where we are. We haven't hit the inflection point in the curve yet, but we are approaching that. And that's both a cause for concern and a cause for hope. Concern because we'll be seeing more of this behavior, odds are, due to simple market incentives in the future. Hope because we're not there yet. We're not at the mass adoption point. And if we as law enforcement move in quickly, if we get ahead of this technology, if we become the owners of this technology, we have greater mastery than the criminals, we can divert a lot of crime that would otherwise take place. So, again, how do we respond? Kind of what I just said. We need to get ahead of it. We need to become the kind of the masters of this domain. And that might seem daunting to some people now, but consider this. This is not the first time that we had to innovate. You're seeing here is a cell phone, one of the first cell phones, and a letter that discussed one of the first bank wire transfers. Now, nowadays, as a federal prosecutor, if my agent rushed over to me and said, oh no, we found out a criminal is using a cell phone and is making wire transfers, I would say, why would you say it's a problem? That's fantastic. That only gives us data. It's bad for the criminal that he's using these technologies. And at some point, the opposite was true. We didn't know how to respond to it. We have to just learn from these prior lessons. The faster we innovate, the faster we learn, the faster we develop new techniques, the earlier we'll be able to stop this crisis. And so, essentially now, I want to talk for a few minutes before turning over to Michelle about some of the actions we're taking, some of the early successes that we have. So we're already at a point where we're giving prosecutors and agents the training and tools they need to make these new types of cases. We have aggressive training in a number of areas. We're updating agency policies, and we're creating new task forces. We also have successful current initiatives. You've heard about some of them now. We've had significant darknet prosecutions. The Attorney General has already talked about them in his speech. We've been holding Chinese drug manufacturers accountable. We've been finding them and prosecuting them based upon evidence that we could use and prove up entirely in US courts. In addition, we've been establishing that these Chinese manufacturers are also violating Chinese law. And we've been trying to put China to account, as Attorney General Sessions mentioned in a press conference a little over a month ago, and asked China to get involved and to prosecute people who are committing crimes under their own law in their own soil when they're hurting US citizens. We've had tremendous cryptocurrency seizures, thanks in large part to Michelle Corver and her colleagues at MLARS. We've had great early work in J-Code, Operation Disarray being one example. And we've had fantastic interagency coordination, because again, this is a multi-level threat and requires a combined response. Then lastly here, there's more steps we need to take. This is an open event, so I don't feel comfortable talking about DOJ's playbook to the extent I even know it, but there's a lot more that has to happen. We're going to make the darknet unsafe for criminals. We're going to use cryptocurrencies to our advantage. We're going to change the incentives So for criminals, it's no longer a good idea to get involved in the drug trade, particularly through the dark net and cryptocurrencies. They'll know that, if anything, it will lead to us coming to their door. And through that, we can help to end this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Michelle, we touched on the threat of cryptocurrency. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in digital currency and the Criminal Division's Digital Currency Initiative?
Sure. So I'll actually go to that slide first. As Matt discussed, oh, that's fairly loud. Cryptocurrency is a really important part of this, trying to attack this problem with all vectors. And thankfully, the prosecutors out in the field working in the U.S. Attorney's offices and the Criminal Division attorneys and the investigators in these federal law enforcement agencies, they know how to conduct financial investigations. And ultimately, what we're looking at is cryptocurrency as a way of following the money and trying to exploit the various pieces of evidence that cryptocurrency transactions can lead us to. As far as the aggressive training and trying to give the resources to the field that they need, we have this digital currency initiative at Money Laundering Section. And what we have been doing there is doing training across the country, all the way from regulatory agencies who are seeing things, U.S. attorneys' offices and their prosecutors, OCDF task forces and meetings, and even in regional areas, we have a talented army of subject matter experts that understand this stuff and can teach even your local officers who are making car stops, that are knocking on doors in routine cases that they may stumble upon darknet and cryptocurrency types of cases, teaching them to recognize these things and knowing that there are resources that can help them in order to further the cases. It's not just the training. For all of you who are U.S. attorneys out there, know that there are talented prosecutors out there who know this subject matter well within your offices, and they're very gracious with their time and helping others. I thank you for supporting them and saying yes when they get requests to go out and train others that maybe need help. So we work together as a team trying to multiply our forces, train the trainers, so that when there is this small drug case that happens in a district and the agent walks into the door and says, this is involving the darknet and Bitcoin, and the attorney has never been exposed to that, then there's someone that they can call and there are resources available so that we can work on those cases more effectively. I'm going to go back. So ultimately, I want to bring the good news. And the good news is that although this is a new and sometimes mysterious technology, that really we're just looking at electronic transfer of funds. And thankfully, a lot of the activity is occurring in Bitcoin, which occurs on a public blockchain, a public distributed ledger. And so we have the ability to trace transactions to locations where data is being collected and evidence is there for us to send subpoenas to, and to also seize assets at ends of cases if we can find the assets sitting in the wallets. So rest assured, we're being creative. We're trying to streamline policies to make the job easier for the prosecutors to get these records from the on and off ramp types of institutions, and also to seize these assets from, in particular, the suppliers and the large level vendors, so that we can take away the financial incentive, and we can also take those funds and use them towards programs to further the investigations and prosecutions in this space. One last thing I would mention is that I think in this space, I'm encouraged that we're seeing a lot more money laundering prosecutions occurring, because tracing these transactions is often a really excellent way to develop attribution evidence, where we have folks behind computers and using the Tor network and following the money separate from wanting to seize their assets, often it will land us in a place where we can actually identify these folks out in, I don't want to say the real world, but the world that we know well, that are sitting in evidence and data that's sitting in financial institutions and other cryptocurrency service providers. So with that,
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to turn it over now to MJ to talk to us about her work in the identification and analysis of new synthetic opioids and psychoactive substances, as well as the postal and cross-border threat. Thanks, MJ.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring the good news at the end of this, but I'm all about starting with the reality and diagnosing the problem where it is, and then working to the solution. And so yesterday, folks, Bloomberg had a headline in the paper that said cocaine deaths up 22% in the United States. Opioid overdoses have leveled off. Today, while I sit here in this wonderful meeting, the Health and Human Services Director has said opioid deaths are leveling off. Now, those are the authorities we work with, and I am not here to question them, but I am here to ask you to do one favor, and that's to go deeper and go under and find out whether in your community that is really true. What do I mean by that? Well, opioid overdoses, if we look at the death certificates, if we look at what is being tested for in the toxicology, we see one set of data. But the death numbers are very, very complex. The toxicology that is being done by the medical examiners is very costly, very time consumptive, and many of the medical examiners don't have that ability. Many of the medical examiners have run out of money to do autopsies, and so they ebb and flow. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have hope. We should always have hope, and we should particularly have hope now. But here is this is a CDC headline, and everything that I'm going to talk to you about today, I want to make clear to you, is open source, it is online. Much of what I learn about this crisis, I learn online. I Google congressional testimony opioids once a week just to learn something new. I encourage you to do that. But this is a CDC publication from July. Rising numbers of deaths involving fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, including carfentanil, and increased usage and mixing of non-opioids. This is a SAMHSA headline, and you will see here that the second block down, a lack of awareness about the potency of synthetic opioids, their availability, and the increasing adulteration of illicit drug supplies pose substantial risk to individual and public health. And synthetic opioids are being increasingly found in our legacy drugs of heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and counterfeit pills. Now, when I first heard that, I called the medical examiner in Cuyahoga County, which is the Northern District of Ohio, and I said, what? Cocaine death, I know cocaine is dangerous, but it doesn't kill people in those numbers. And Tom Gilson, the medical examiner there, said, that's the fentanyl in it that's killing the people, MJ. So we need the science to lead us. And if the U.S. attorneys in here go home and do one thing, call a crime lab, call a medical examiner's office, and ask them what their capabilities are and what you can do to work within their capabilities. So what do I mean with the emerging, with the data? What do we really know about it? Again, this is open source. This is the DEA Emerging Threat Report from mid-year 2018. If you go onto the NDEWS network and sign up, that is NDEWS, you can see the latest drug report. But you see here that there were 283 synthetic cannabinoid identifications in the first half of the year. 13 identifications of fentanyl compounds, and other opioids, and that includes the U47700 and the U compounds, which are just as deadly as the fentanyls. We've heard that it killed our friend's son here today. 141 cathinones, and this is very, very important. These are drugs that were detected for the first time by the DEA in 2018. 2 cannabinoids, 1 non-fentanyl, a U compound, 1 fentanyl precursor, 1 fentanyl, and 1 cathinone. That is one set of data that comes from seized drugs. The work that I do with my partners, and we sit here in the Department of Justice, but my partners that I work with often are Homeland Security Investigations and Customs and Border Protections. Customs and Border Protection are on the first line of this. At the mail facilities, at the FedEx facilities, they are doing really God's work in this epidemic. And we have partnered with them in OCDF, where we're a funded strategy that sits over the whole of government, many agencies, to dismantle and disrupt major drug trafficking organizations. We have a partnership with them in the Centers for Disease Control, that when a substance comes through a port and we can't detect it, it's diverted out, it's sent to a specialty lab, and we are getting identifications that take other labs between 6 months and 24 months. We're getting that down to 21 days, thanks to funding from the Centers for Disease Control. These are the new substances that have been found in our port project, and again, this is open source. It's on the Center for Forensic Science and Research Education Network. You can go on and get it. But we have found 5 hallucinogens, 5 cathinones, 7 cannabinoids, 3 non-opioid fentanyls, 4 fentanyl analogs, and 4 fentanyl precursors, and out of this list, 22 of them are different than what the DEA has on their list. So, what is this telling us, folks? This is the rate this is evolving. Why does that matter to your scientists? What are you going to say to your scientists when you go home? Find them because they're there? That is a very, very difficult thing to do. It takes testing by $500,000, $1 million equipment. It takes expanded panel testing. You often have to tell the machines what to look for, or you can't find them. And you need a reference standard to be able to do a positive identification. Those are the challenges, some of the challenges with this polydrug epidemic. Where is it coming in? You've heard that it is coming in. It's coming in through Postal, and it's coming in through FedEx. And I am not an apologist for either of those folks, but I want you to know this. I have been to that facility, that FedEx facility now, 20 times? It always looks like that. 155,000 a month coming out through China, 155,000. And the Customs and Border Protection people who are charged with detecting this are also charged with keeping us safe from explosives and live pythons and all other things coming through that port. Try to find the drugs, and pull them out of there. At JFK today, 2 million packages are coming in from China, folks, and they carry my new dresses and my new shoes along with somebody else's fentanyl. These are the challenges we face, but I do have good news. I'll sit back down. I get passionate when I get to the FedEx hub because I think it's now my second home. So, you've heard from our colleagues about the dark web. I want you to know that with Postal, Postal is looking at the dark web, Postal is looking at the high web. The open web is also a place where these drugs are coming through. If everybody goes home and tells their high school principals to tell their the parents in their place to check web browsers and web histories, I want to be careful there, but they're your kids, they're your privacy rights. That's where we see what's going on with some of this fentanyl coming in. The Postal slide that I just showed you, an audit has been done. It says that they are doing great work in putting together analytics. The bill that just passed Congress, the soft bill, it's going to require advanced electronic data. We have progress going in that. We have Postal working on their own to reach collaborative agreements with international shippers to get voluntary advanced data. We have great collaborations between Customs and Border Protection, Homeland Security, and FedEx, DHL, and UPS to put analytics in place to help Customs and Border Protection do targeting. So there is a lot of good going on there. But what I've heard today, I couldn't agree with more. While all of this goes on at the federal level, where this is going to be solved is at the state and local level. We need to, when we see a cluster outbreak, we need, number one, to recognize that it's probably not fentanyl alone. These days we're seeing it in the weirdest combinations that don't make sense. Fentanyl with cocaine, fentanyl with meth. We're seeing this Santa Muerte outbreak in Philadelphia that was fentanyl, heroin, and 5-FABD. I'm not a scientist, but I run with my scientists because they hold the keys to this. This was diagnosed in 36 hours due to aggressive work by state and local law enforcement and by this scientific partner and by the DEA and by the public health. Everybody got together and got those samples set in, and we found these identifications, and those went out to public health and those went out to law enforcement. And what difference did that make? It made it so the emergency room doctors who were taking people in who were suffering from this, they knew how to treat them. They knew what blood tests were run. The first responders out there on the scene knew that fentanyl, that Narcan alone might not work, and when people were waking up, they were going to be angry and aggressive because of the K2, the cannabinoid in there. It wasn't K2, I used that shortcut. But those are the kinds of things as to why the drug identifications are so very, very important, and how state, local, DEA, public health, public safety can band together, and whenever you see a cluster outbreak, it can be solved. Here is, this is from congressional testimony 2018. I say that so you know that it is open source data. This is what is being used to beating vulnerabilities through the whole of government approach. We're all partnering with the Postal Service on advanced data and using the data that they get now in a way that is prioritized and used to its fullest extent. Detection of the substances at the ports, that's the port project I spoke about with Customs and Border Protection and partnership with the Centers for Disease Control. We issue monographs out every time to anybody who wants one when we identify a new drug. If you want to get on that list, come and see me when we're done. And then we are working with, as you can see here, all of the federal agencies, public health, public safety, and the HIDAs, and the locals to put analytics in place to disrupt and dismantle. This only have 2 more slides. Dissemination strategies. Once you get that new identification, these have to go out to public health, your federal partners, the networks that talk about those things like NDUS and Juan Cologne's New Jersey DMI, shout out to Juan, to local law enforcement crime labs, to everybody, as this is all an interrelated whole. And sometimes, folks, I think that they make me laugh because I'm half cheerleader, and I am. Here's what I want you to know. I don't know any more about fentanyl or synthetic opioids or anything than you do. I got to this chair because I don't want to hear Mr. Raines say anymore, my son is dead. I don't want Kevin to say, that chair is empty. And I sure don't want any of us sitting in this room to say, are you sure you want me? If you have a heart, and you're here, you have a heart, you got a brain, you got a computer, you got a telephone, you go home and you tell people this matters to me, let's sit down in a room and have a cup of coffee, and we start solving this crisis there. And take this out with you, it's my quote that I keep on my bedroom door. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that do. I'm going to be one of those folks. You coming with me? I bet you are.
Thank you. Thank you, MJ. You always inspire me whenever I talk to you. And thanks to all of our panelists. I have a question. The DEA, on a temporary basis, scheduled fentanyl as a class, which helped us prosecutors not have to rely on the Analog Act, which can be burdensome to prosecute. But it's still, the Analog Act is still there and available to us here in the United States to meet the threat of all these new psychoactive substances. China, which we know is supplying pretty much all of these substances, lacks an Analog Act or equivalent law criminalizing the distribution of chemicals that are functionally identical to controlled substances. How does the lack of a China Analog Act impact synthetic opioid trafficking in the United States? And this question, we can start with Matt and then move down.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Mary, you hit the nail on the head there. So China discusses how they've been controlling these various substances and doing their part, and of course we're extremely grateful for their help in that area. But as Mary noted, with a lack of an Analog Act, it's effectively impossible to catch up. There was a report out, a State Department report that quoted a UN report that discussed how there were 800 new analogs, psychoactive substances, that have already been produced in a short amount of time, and it averages one new substance a week. And I can say for my own prosecutions that in China, you can have a gigantic drug trafficking organization, and they will have, say, carfentanil. And then after, the Chinese government will say, we're going to schedule carfentanil in 30 days. They will sell it for 29 days. And then by the 30th day, they just added an atom, a molecule, some slight difference, sometimes making it even more deadly. And then they sell carfentanil plus. And then carfentanil plus is going to be scheduled in 30 days. And they keep doing it indefinitely. So in that sense, China can schedule all the drugs they want, and we're appreciative that they are. But without an Analog Act or without scheduling entire types of chemicals, it's an impossible task no matter how much China wants to help out with this global problem.
So I want to share with you, if you're sitting there thinking, if we were able to schedule a fentanyl by fentanyl-related substances by a core structure, why don't we do that with cathinones and cannabinoids and get that done? The difference is that those substances do not have a like core structure. All of the fentanyl analogs, you have a 5-part core structure that is reflected in the DEA scheduling, and you take one piece or 2 pieces away, it still has a fentanyl core. Cathinones and cannabinoids don't work like that. My friend Jordan Leiter is here in the audience today from the criminal division. He has done great work to get our sentencing guidelines to understand that while we can't do scheduling by fentanyl-related substances by the chemical structure, we can do it by effect on the human body. And he got those changes through last year. So the Analog Act remains, China doesn't have one. Ours remains problematic because you have to show the chemical similarity and also the effect of on the human body, largely the neurologic systems. So it is a problem, but as Matt pointed out, and what our partners who are the important people who talk with the Chinese would want you to know, is that when they go over and have dialogue with our international partners, what those international partners want to know is what is the exact harm that is caused, what drug caused it, where did it come through, how do you know that, how many people are dead, and what else do you know about the seizures? And when they have hard data, that's when they will act to schedule, and that's when they will act to take whatever actions they're taking over there. So please, when you are getting again, I'm back to the medical examiners. They are the most underappreciated and under-resourced community that we work with today. We want all of their data to be able to identify what is killing people, but they're state funded, and from a federal perspective, they work only with Coverdell grants and other grants. If you can go home and talk with your medical examiners about what they're able to do and what they would be able to do with partnership in you would take this a long way. And we've got to do those types of things to get the hard data until China gets an analog act.
Thank you, Matt and MJ. I'm going to shift over to Michelle. Michelle, what are some of the challenges law enforcement agents and prosecutors face in cases involving cryptocurrency?
So although we're very competent at conducting financial investigations and generally tracing financial transactions, we are constantly playing catch up because the technology is just changing so quickly. And that's really been the big challenge, and why the training portion and the talking to each other about what we're seeing across the country and internationally as well is really important. One of the things that you may have heard about that is increasing is the use of what we call anonymity enhanced cryptocurrencies, or AECs. An example of one would be Monero. And these are cryptocurrencies that, unlike Bitcoin, they operate on private or partially private blockchains, which means we either can't, or it's very hard for us to trace those transactions. And so then we're having a harder time identifying those vendors and suppliers that are actually receiving these funds, as well as the money launderers who are supporting them. But the good news is that all of the federal law enforcement agencies, in partnership with academic institutions and commercial companies, we are always trying to think ahead of things, to be creative, to recruit mathematicians, to try to defeat some of these technologies outright, and until we can, just being creative about the things that we know how to do well, and that is following these things to the on and off ramps, because ultimately you can't pay your mortgage or your grocery bill or buy a fancy car with Monero. You can buy a fancy car with Bitcoin, but you have to cash this out at some point. And so that's what we try to focus on in the meantime, at the same time that we're pursuing answers to the new technologies that are adjusting as we get very good at our job. So as law enforcement is effective, these folks, they just like with the changing of the drugs, they change their tools in order to get around what we've done well. But we stay on top of them, and again, the time and the academic articles that help everyone, and saying yes to small Title 31 prosecutions in the offices. Those, sometimes it's the people that are out on the street facilitating the cashing out of this stuff that are allowing this to continue. And so they may seem like small cases, but looking at it from the micro to the macro level with this cryptocurrency is really important to furthering the successful prosecutions of these dangerous drug cases.
Thank you. It looks like we're out of time, but I really want to thank all three of you for participating in today's panel. These are challenges that our prosecutors and investigators are facing every single day in the field, and you three are really leaders in this field and are going to help our prosecutors and our investigators stay on top of this threat. So thank you all very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this summit. It's been very productive, and I hope that it leads to an exchange of ideas about our approach to the opioid crisis, and it will reinforce the importance of enforcement along with our prevention and treatment efforts. I want to thank everybody from across the department and beyond who've made this summit a success. I especially want to thank within the department the individuals from the Office of the Attorney General, the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, the Office of Public Affairs, Office of Legal Policy, the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys, the Office of Justice Program, and the Justice Management Division. And I'm sure I'm missing some of the components who helped. Thank you all for everything you've done to make this summit a success. And please, everybody, as you leave, remember that Saturday is DEA's National Prescription Drug Take Back Day, and I hope you'll participate. Thank you again. I'm sorry to talk about this stuff all day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for putting this together. Fantastic. Many hats.
With 12 days to go until the midterm elections, the Washington Post is hosting an election preview with